Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1. The Death Bus. I work the night shift in an office building downtown, and every night after work I walk home. It's not a long walk, only about 20 minutes through the deserted streets. Sometimes I think I should buy a car, but the city has a pretty good public transportation system, and I'm used to this kind of life. It all started one October evening when the weather was starting to get cold. I was walking home on the familiar road, lined with old buildings on both sides, the yellow street lights shining on the cracked sidewalks. As I passed the bus stop near my house, I noticed a man standing there. The man was wearing a long gray coat, the collar pulled up high, covering most of his face. He stood still, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, not moving at all. I don't know why I felt a chill down my spine when I saw him. Maybe because his silhouette was so still, or maybe because that bus stop had been abandoned for years. I was sure that this bus line had stopped operating long ago. No one was waiting for the bus here, but he was still there. I walked faster, trying to ignore the feeling of unease. As I passed by, I could feel his eyes following me, but I didn't dare to turn around. In the following days, I started to notice him more. Every night when I passed the bus stop, he was still standing there, unchanged. Not moving, not blinking, not showing any signs of a normal person. One time, I tried slowing down, pretending to tie my shoelaces a distance away from the bus stop. I wanted to observe him more closely, but as soon as I looked up, I felt like he had moved a little closer, still standing there, still wearing the same old overcoat, but the distance between us seemed to have shortened. Even though I didn't hear any footsteps, I don't know if I imagined it or not, but there was something wrong with him, not human. The following week, I started to feel haunted. I told my colleagues about him during breaks, but they just laughed, saying he was probably a homeless person or some weirdo. I wanted to believe it, but every night when I saw him, I felt something was very wrong. He didn't smoke. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't do any of the things a normal person might do while waiting for a bus. He just stood there, silent as a statue. And then one night, I decided to do something stupid. I waited for the bus with him. That night, it was colder than usual. The street lights flickered as if they were about to go out. I walked to the bus stop and stopped, just a few feet away from him. It felt awful to be so close to him. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, and I could hear a very small, whisper-like sound coming from inside his trench coat. I looked toward the empty street, telling myself that there would definitely be no bus coming. But then I heard the sound of wheels rolling on the pavement. My heart sank as I saw an old bus slowly approaching the stop. It wasn't the modern bus I was used to seeing in the city. It looked old, rusty, as if it had been abandoned for years, but somehow still running. The door opened with a deafening screech. I looked inside. The seats were dark, with no passengers. The driver was wearing a tattered uniform, a hat pulled down over most of his face. The man beside me moved for the first time since I'd met him. He got on the bus, slowly, as if he had done it 100 times before. I stood still, my heart pounding. Part of me screamed that I shouldn't get on, that I should run away now. But the bus doors were still open, as if waiting for me. "Aren't you getting on?" a voice called out. I turned. The man had sat down in one of the rows near the door. For the first time, I saw his face clearly. And it wasn't a human face. I couldn't quite describe it. But there was something wrong with him. His eyes were too deep, like bottomless pits. His smile was too wide, longer than any smile I'd ever seen. The bus doors began to close. I took a step back, then two. When the doors were completely closed, I heard a soft laugh from inside. The bus started to roll, then gradually disappeared into the night. I stood there, my body cold, my heart pounding. The next day, I looked up information about this bus line. As I remembered, it had stopped operating nearly 10 years ago after a terrible accident. A bus full of passengers had plunged off a bridge on a rainy night and no one had survived. The bus had never been found, but I knew it was still running. And I knew that every night, someone was waiting for it. After that night, I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. But how could I explain the bus that had appeared on a route that had been abandoned for nearly a decade? How could I forget that inhuman face and the laughter that echoed as the bus door slammed shut? Every night after that, I deliberately took a detour home, away from the bus stop. But no matter how hard I tried, the feeling of being watched did not go away. In my dreams, I saw him again, the man in the grey trench coat, standing in the mist. He did not move, did not speak, but those deep black eyes kept staring at me, as if waiting. 2 weeks passed. One night, I decided to break my fear. I had to face it. I could no longer live in fear that something was following me. So on the 15th night, since I last saw that bus, I headed home by the same road, the one that led past the bus stop. It was colder than usual, the wind whistling through the old buildings. As I approached the stop, I slowed down. The street lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the pavement. And then I saw him. The man was still standing there, still stiff-faced and wearing a grey trench coat. But this time, he wasn't looking down the road like he always did. He was looking at me. I stopped. My heart was pounding in my chest. It was as if an invisible string was tying me to that gaze. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could make a sound, a distant screech rang out. The sound of a bus braking. The feeling came back, a chill running down my spine. I glanced toward the street and saw something I never wanted to see again. The rusty old bus, slowly rolling toward the station. The doors opened with a deafening screech. This time, I didn't look inside. I didn't want to see the driver. Didn't want to see the darkness swallowing the seats. I just stood there, frozen. The man beside me moved. He walked toward the door, but instead of getting in like last time, he turned and looked at me. "You've waited long enough." His voice was hoarse and hollow, as if it came from somewhere other than this world. My heart was pounding. "What did you say?" I stepped back, but I felt an invisible force holding me still. "We chose you," he continued. "This time, it's your turn." I swallowed, my mind reeling. My turn? For what? He didn't answer. He just lifted his foot and stepped onto the bus. I watched him move inside, sitting down on one of the rows of seats near the door. But the bus door didn't close. It was still open, as if waiting for me to get in. I don't know how long I stood there. A minute? 5 minutes? Time seemed to have lost its meaning. I couldn't take my eyes off the bus. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. Then I heard footsteps. Not the man's, not the driver's. It was something else. I sensed movement inside the bus, in the darkness. Heavy footsteps, as if something was crawling toward the door. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. An invisible presence, large and cold. The bus door was still open, waiting. I trembled, taking a step back. At that moment, a voice rang out in my head. Not a voice, but a strange thought. A consciousness that crept into my mind. Go! No, I couldn't. I didn't want to. I turned and ran. Footsteps echoed behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I ran at full speed, through every corner, every alley, without stopping. I had the feeling that if I stopped, even for a second, the thing would grab me, drag me onto that monstrous bus. Finally, I reached home. I rushed inside, locked the door, pressed my back against the wall, and gasped. Outside, the city was as quiet as ever, as if nothing had happened. I didn't go out for the next 2 days. I didn't go to work, didn't answer my colleagues' calls. I just sat in my apartment, the curtains drawn, trying to push away that feeling of terror. But then, something even scarier happened. On Tuesday night, as I lay in bed, I heard a familiar sound outside my window. The screech of a bus braking. I froze. My apartment was on the 4th floor. How could there be a bus parked outside my window? But as I pulled back the curtains and looked down, my heart almost stopped. The bus was parked right in front of the building. The door opened, and the man in the grey trench coat was standing right in front of the bus. He looked up straight into my window. His mouth twitched into a crooked smile. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone, intending to call the police, but the screen lit up before I could do anything. A text message, no number, just 3 words. Your turn. I threw my phone on the bed, my whole body stiff. The message on the screen was still glowing in the darkness. Your turn. No phone number. No sign of who had sent the message. But I knew it was him. Outside the window, the bus stood silently in the dark, its headlights dimly illuminating the deserted street below. The man in the grey trench coat was no longer standing at the door. Where was he? A chill ran down my spine as I peered more closely through the curtains. His silhouette, now standing directly below my building, raising his head, looking straight at me. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't say anything. But I knew, even if I closed the curtains or turned off all the lights, he would still be there, waiting. My turn. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I huddled in the corner of the room, my eyes glued to the front door, as if afraid that if I blinked, it would open and he would come in. But nothing happened. As dawn broke, I crept to the window, parting the curtains just a little to look down the street. The bus was gone. So was the man. I felt a cold rush of air rush into my lungs as I realized that. There was no sign of him. No tire prints on the pavement. Not a speck of oil or dirt, as if the bus had never existed. I staggered to my feet, a numb feeling washing over me. I wasn't crazy. It was all real. But if it was, what was I supposed to do next? I decided I couldn't keep quiet any longer. That night, I called an old friend, Ryan, a paranormal reporter. I didn't believe in the supernatural before, but after everything that had happened, I needed someone who could believe in something even I didn't want to admit. Ryan came to my apartment late that afternoon. He had a thick notebook and a small tape recorder with him. As I recounted everything, from the first night I saw the man to the ghostly text message that appeared on my phone, Ryan took notes in silence, nodding every now and then as if connecting the dots. "It sounds like a ghost bus story," Ryan said when I was finished. "But it's not just an urban legend. It sounds like it's targeting you." I shivered. "So, do you know what happened to the people who were called?" Ryan looked at me for a long moment and then shook his head. "Nobody knows, because those people disappeared." I swallowed. "You mean they never came back?" "Yes." Ryan lowered his voice. "They left no trace, no witnesses, no security camera footage of them leaving. They just disappeared. Gone." The words rang in my head like a death knell. That night, Ryan offered to stay with me. Though he didn't say it, I knew he was uneasy too. We set up our cameras, set up a recorder on the table, even set up a small camera pointed at my window. "I want to see if anything comes up," Ryan said. I had no intention of objecting. His presence made me feel a little less scared. But no matter what I did, I knew it wouldn't stop the bus from coming back, because it was waiting for me. That night, everything seemed normal. No strange text messages, no screeching of the bus brakes, no sign of the man in the gray trench coat down the street. But at 2 a.m. I woke up to a sound, the squeak of the bus door opening. I stiffened. Ryan was still asleep on the sofa by the window. I touched his shoulder, trembling. "Ryan," I whispered, "it's here." Ryan jumped up immediately, his eyes wide. Neither of us dared to go near the window, but one thing I knew for sure. The bus was waiting. We heard another sound. This time, it wasn't a bus. It was a knock on the door. We both looked at each other, our hearts racing. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking was steady, not too loud, but not too soft, as if someone was patiently waiting for me to open the door. I crept closer, trembling. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. The door was empty. But when I turned around, Ryan looked like he'd seen a ghost. He was looking at the tape recorder on the table, his eyes wide. I think you should hear this," he stammered. I picked up the tape recorder and pressed the play button. At first, there was only the sound of our breathing and the faint sounds of movement in the room. But then, a voice spoke. "It's time." A deep, distorted voice, as if it were coming from far away. And though I had never heard him speak clearly before, I knew who it was. The man waiting for the bus. This time, I couldn't run away. I had to get to the bottom of this. "Ryan," I said, my voice shaking, "we have to get back to the bus stop." He looked at me like I was crazy. "What did you say? You want to go where he's waiting for you?" "We have no choice," I said. "I can't just hide. If I don't do anything, he'll take me away from me sooner or later. I have to know what the hell is going on." Ryan looked at me for a long moment. Then he sighed and muttered a curse. "Okay, but if we see anything strange, we run away." I nodded. We left the apartment at 3 a.m., and I knew at that old bus stop he was waiting for me. We walked to the bus stop in heavy silence. The night wind blew cold, rushing through the dark alleys of the city. I could feel every nerve in my body tense, alerting me to the slightest sign of danger. Ryan walked beside me, the recorder clutched tightly in his hand. Neither of us said anything. but we both knew that something was terribly wrong ahead. The bus stop came into view. It was the same old, dilapidated place as every night, but this time, something was different. The air around it was thick, as if it were cut off from the rest of the world. I couldn't see the man in the grey coat, but I knew he was close. We were standing just a few feet from the bus stop. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Are you sure? We can still go back." I swallowed. "No, if I don't do this, I'll never get away from him." Ryan nodded, but I could see the panic in his eyes. Then, we waited. 3:13 a.m., no one was around. The streets were eerily quiet, as if the entire city had fallen into a deep sleep that would never wake up. 3:15 a.m. Nothing happened. I began to wonder if I had been wrong this time, if it was all just my imagination. 3:17 a.m. The sound of wheels rolling down the street echoed. My heart clenched. I turned my head to the distance, and even though I knew what was coming, I still felt a pang of dread as I saw the rusty old bus approaching. It appeared from a corner of an empty street where no other traffic had passed. The headlights were dim, the body of the car swaying slowly like a living thing. It shouldn't be there, but it was. Ryan took a deep breath, instinctively stepping back. Oh my God, it's real. The bus stopped right in front of us. The screech of brakes was like a scream from hell. The door opened with a deafening screech. This time, I looked inside, and I wished I had never done so. There were no passengers inside, but the darkness inside was so thick that it was impossible to see the end. The seats were old and torn, and the floor had dark stains that looked like dried blood. The smell of mold mixed with something else. The smell of decay. The driver was still there. He didn't move, but I could feel his eyes through his shabby hat. He had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just a black void, as if someone had erased his face from existence. I felt my body go cold. Then, a voice spoke. "Get in." Neither of us spoke, but the voice continued, clearer this time, echoing in my head like a persistent nightmare. "Your turn." The bus door was still open, as if waiting for me. Ryan shook his head violently, tugging at my hand. "No, this can't be. Let's go." I wanted to listen to him. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. There was another voice inside me, not the bus's voice, but my own. If I don't get on, will it continue to haunt me forever? And if I do, where will I go? I looked at the bus. Something in the darkness inside moved. I didn't have time to think. I firmly pushed Ryan's hand away and took a step toward the bus. "Are you crazy?" Ryan almost shouted, but I didn't turn around. I stepped onto the first step. The temperature inside the bus was unbearable. My breath turned into a thin white mist. I continued walking. Ryan was still standing outside, his face pale. "You have to stop. We don't know what the hell is waiting inside." The door slammed shut the moment I stepped onto the floor. I turned, panicked, and banged on the window. "Ryan, open the door." But Ryan couldn't do anything. The bus had already started moving. I was plunged into darkness. The bus was moving faster than it should have. Everything outside the windows was fading away. No more streets, no more lights, just endless darkness. I turned to look ahead. The driver was still sitting there, motionless. "Where is this?" I whispered, but no one answered. Then I heard it, the whisper. At first it was very small, almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder, dozens, hundreds of voices at once. Whispers that made no sense. But I knew, I understood. They were people who had been on this bus, people who would never return. I screamed, but my voice faded into the air, as if there was no place for human screams. The darkness consumed me. Outside at the bus station, Ryan stood in silence. There was no bus, no tire tracks on the road. There was no sound except the cold wind whistling through the city. He shivered, eyes wide. He disappeared. Ryan never saw me again, but every night when he passed that old bus stop, he always felt like someone was waiting there. Not the man in the grey coat. Me. Story 2. Gifts from Darkness. That morning, as Emily Carter stepped out onto the front steps to pick up the morning paper, she had no idea that a small gift would be the start of a nightmare. On her doorstep, neatly placed on the old wooden steps, was a box wrapped in rough brown paper. There was no return address, no writing on it, just a small square box tied tightly with hemp string. Emily hesitated. Maybe someone had sent it by mistake, or a prank by the neighborhood kids. She bent down, touched the rough paper. Cold, a wet feeling passed through her fingers. There was something inside the box. She carried it into the house, set it on the kitchen counter, took a deep breath, and untied the string. The brown paper fell away, revealing an old wooden box, strangely scratched on the surface. She opened the lid. Inside was an old doll. Cloth, dangling limbs, sunken black button eyes, frayed wool curls. It smelled musty, a suffocating smell, as if no one had touched it for a long time. Emily shivered. She didn't like dolls, especially old ones like this one. But what had someone left it on her doorstep for? She glanced around the kitchen, out the window. No one, not a soul on the quiet street in front of the house. Finally, she decided to throw it in the trash can in the yard. The next day, another box appeared. Same old way, wrapped in brown paper, right on the doorstep. This time, Emily felt a distinct unease. It could have been a coincidence, but 2 days in a row? An old doll yesterday, and what today? She opened the box, feeling her heart beat a little faster. Inside was a desk clock. Old dusty, the second hand had stopped. Emily looked closer. The glass had a small crack, as if it had been dropped. And on the clock face, the hands had stopped at a certain time. 3:17 a.m. She shivered. For some reason, that number made her feel uneasy. She quickly closed the lid, put it in the drawer, and tried to ignore it. Maybe someone was playing a prank on her, but the next morning, a third box appeared. Emily didn't want to open it again, but curiosity and a vague fear made it impossible to ignore. She tore the wrapping paper off, her heart pounding. This time, what was inside wasn't a harmless toy or a clock. It was a human tooth. The front tooth, the root intact, with some dry tissue clinging to it. Emily screamed, dropping the box to the floor. She backed away, her hand covering her mouth. Someone was playing a prank on her. A sick joke. She ran into the house and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and called the police. The police showed up within 20 minutes. Officer Daniel Harper, a middle-aged man with a hard face, picked up the box and examined it. "No sign of the sender?" he asked. Emily shook her head. Harper frowned, looking down at the tooth. "We'll have it tested. Do you suspect someone could have done this?" Emily tried to remember. She had no enemies. She was just an ordinary office worker, living a quiet life in this small house in Bakersfield, California. "No, I don't know." She shook her head. Harper nodded, writing something down in her notebook. If anything else happens, call us. But Emily didn't have to wait long. The next morning, another box appeared. This time, she didn't need to open it to know what was inside would drive her crazy. Because this time, there was a smear of dried blood on the lid. She swallowed, carefully opening the box. Inside was a piece of human skin. Not just any skin. It had a scar. A long, faint scar. Exactly like the scar on Emily's arm. She screamed, backing away, feeling like the world was spinning around her. Someone was watching her, knew her, and now they were playing on her fear in the sickest way possible. She shook her head and dialed the police. But then, she saw a figure outside the window. A shadowy figure, not moving, just standing there. Staring straight at her, Emily slumped on the sofa, her eyes fixed on the new box on her doorstep. She didn't dare open it. The horror of yesterday still weighed heavily on her heart, making each beat a reminder of what she had seen. 3 boxes, 3 strange gifts, and each one haunted her more than the last. But today's box was different. It was no ordinary gift. It was a warning, a message. She didn't know what to do. She was filled with worry and doubt. Who had done this? Was someone playing a prank on her? Or was there something more terrifying waiting for her? All she knew was that someone was watching her, knew her. She looked out the window at the empty street in front of her house. No one. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. 3 steady knocks. Emily jumped, her heart pounding. She looked toward the door. Maybe it was the delivery man, or that person? She stood up, her legs shaking as she walked toward the door. Each step felt like a punch to the head, as if the closer she got, the more scared she felt. She carefully looked through the crack in the door, but saw no one. The welcome mat was still sitting silently in front of the house. But the box was no longer there. It was gone. No way, she muttered. She turned to look inside the house. The scenery was the same. Everything was still quiet. But a cold feeling enveloped the room. She pushed the door open, looked around. No one. No one there, except for the unusual sounds. A soft noise, as if someone was dragging something across the tile floor. She heard it from inside the house. At first, it was just a soft clack. Then the sound of something falling to the floor, echoing in the eerie silence of the evening. Emily stopped, her eyes scanning every corner of the room with fear. She heard a sigh, so low it was almost imperceptible. But it was somewhere in the room. She walked into the living room, touching the wall, feeling its coldness. Only the faint ticking of the clock. Then, laughter. A laugh. Strange, not like a normal person's laughter. It was long, twisted, like someone laughing through pain. Emily stopped breathing, froze. She couldn't say anything. Her eyes were glued to the clock on the table. Suddenly, the hour and minute hands jumped up. 3:17. Exactly the same time as the clock in the box yesterday. Emily began to panic. Her heart felt like it was about to burst out of her chest. She turned back to the table where the box had been yesterday. It was no longer there. She sat down, gasping for breath, her eyes blurred with fear. She couldn't understand what was happening, but one thing she knew for sure. Someone was following her, and they wouldn't stop until she answered. That evening, the police returned after receiving a strange report from Emily. Officer Harper came to her house again, his eyes sharp, his gaze familiar with strange situations. We found no trace, no signs of forced entry. Are you sure no one you know is involved in this? Harper asked. Emily shook her head. She couldn't think of anyone who could do this. She had no enemies. She didn't live in a crime-ridden area. So who and why her? It could be a prank. She tried to calm herself. Someone's been harassing me. Come on. Harper nodded, but his eyes never left hers. Calm down. But if anything else happens, don't hesitate to report it. We'll investigate further. As the police left, Emily felt her fear rise again. She looked back at the box. These strange gifts were no coincidence. She sensed that they had a meaning, a message that she couldn't understand. But there would be no other gifts. There couldn't be. She couldn't take it anymore. The next day, she woke up feeling tense. When she looked out the window, she noticed that it was morning and everything seemed normal. But when she went outside to get the paper, her eyes caught sight of a tiny box on the doorstep. A box identical to the ones before. She stopped. Her heart clenched. It couldn't be. She thought she was dreaming. But no, it was really there. Despite the fear that filled her, Emily slowly walked outside and bent down to pick up the box. It was a plain box with no name or return address. She bit her lip, feeling her hands go cold. This time, she knew it wasn't a joke. And when she opened the box, inside, it was a human tooth, the same tooth she had seen in the previous box. She looked closely and realized this was her tooth. She touched her arm. The scar. That's right. That scar. The one she couldn't explain. She couldn't wait any longer. She rushed to the front door and called the police. Another gift. It's about me. I don't know what to do. But when she looked back at the room, there was something strange about the surroundings. Scratches on the wall, faint fingerprints she had never seen before. Everything suddenly felt different. And this time, something breathed outside the window. Emily couldn't take it anymore. Every hour, every minute, the fear inside her seemed to grow heavier. Every morning when she woke up, the first thing she did was not to open her eyes and take a deep breath, but to look out the window to check if the strange box had appeared on her doorstep. And this morning, she saw it again. The box, wrapped in rough brown paper, sat neatly on the steps. There was no address, no sender's name. It was there, like the previous boxes, like an obsession that she couldn't shake. Emily stood still, her heart pounding. The gifts were getting stranger and more terrifying. She tried to forget them, tried to convince herself that they were all just jokes, but each new item felt like a step closer to the truth she didn't want to face. She took a deep breath, her hands clenching. Then, unable to delay any longer, she stepped outside. This time, she didn't feel the same vague curiosity or fear as before. She knew that each box was a warning, a message she couldn't avoid. A cold feeling emanated from the box as she placed her hand in it. The object inside, unopened, still made her feel the fear spreading, but she couldn't stop. She had to open it. She had to know, no matter the cost. With a decisive movement, she tore off the wrapping paper and opened the box. Inside was a key. A large, old metal key, clearly scratched. No explanation, no message, just the key. She picked it up, feeling a heavy burden rising in her heart. A strange feeling washed over her. Where did the key lead? And who would leave it on her doorstep? She looked around. feeling the silence of the street increase her fear. The street was quiet. The house next door, as usual, empty. No sign of life, except for herself and the key. Suddenly, she heard a knock on the door. 3 regular knocks, like the ones that had sounded the night before. Each knock felt like a beat in her heart. She stepped back, looking at the key in her hand, then at the door. A strong urge told her not to open the door, but part of her felt that something very important would happen if she did. With no other choice, Emily carefully walked toward the door. When she opened it, a man stood there. It was Officer Daniel Harper. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said, his eyes seeming more serious than usual. "I know we've met before, but I think we need to talk more about the boxes you received." Emily froze, her eyes widening. "What are you doing here? Did you know about the boxes?" Harper nodded. "You're not the only one who received them. I've had reports of similar cases in the surrounding areas. But this seems more serious than I thought." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "But I don't understand. Who did this? Why did they do it?" Harper was silent for a long moment, as if thinking about something. Then he held out his hand, motioning for her to come inside. "Miss Carter, I know you're scared, but I need you to stay calm. There's something going on in this area that I can't explain. But I think you've received a message that we can't ignore." Emily looked at him, but inside, she felt a fear that was stronger than ever. "Message? What message?" Harper sat down on the sofa, looking at her wearily. "The boxes and the items inside may be related to a long-ago case. I can't tell you everything, but I'll protect you. We have to find out who's behind this before it's too late." Emily felt that Harper's words were off. From his expression to the way he looked at her, everything showed that he was hiding something. Then a phone rang. Harper quickly pulled out his phone and pressed the answer button. "Harper?" There was a brief silence. "Yes, I understand. I'll be there soon." He hung up the phone and stood up. "Miss Carter, there's an urgent matter. We have to leave now. Don't ask too many questions, but if you want to survive, you have to come with me now." Emily felt the tension rising. "What? What did you say? Why do I have to go with you?" Harper didn't answer, just walked quickly to the door, winking at her to follow. For a moment, Emily hesitated, but then she realized she had no choice. She couldn't stay here alone with these boxes and strange gifts. She couldn't bear this mystery anymore. Harper drove in tense silence, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. She sat quietly beside him, her heart still pounding. She looked at the key in her hand, wondering if it was somehow connected to her life. She felt like she was going on a dark adventure, an inexplicable nightmare. Although Harper didn't say much, throughout the ride, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that everything she was experiencing was just part of a larger story, a story she couldn't understand. When the car stopped in front of an old house, Emily looked up and saw a house with a misty wall, as if it had been abandoned for a long time. "What are we doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harper didn't answer, just got out of the car and looked at her. "Come inside, you'll understand." She had no choice. She followed Harper into that gloomy house where the only light came from dim lamps. A cold feeling enveloped her, as if the coldness of the whole world was gathering here. Stepping inside, something strange happened. The key in her hand suddenly felt hot, and as she looked at the key, a cold feeling enveloped her heart. She knew there was no escape. This adventure had begun, and now she would face something far beyond what she had imagined. The door to the house slammed shut behind her, and Emily knew everything had changed. Story 3. Eyes in the Dark. I've always been an early riser, usually before my alarm clock goes off, just to enjoy a few minutes of quiet before starting my day. Every morning I open my eyes, look around the room, sigh, and reach for my phone. It's my routine. I check my emails, my messages, and especially the photos I took yesterday. My life is nothing special. I work in an advertising agency in Manhattan. I live alone in a small apartment on the 6th floor of an old building. I have few friends, and my evenings are usually just me and the TV. And then, one morning, I open my phone and see a strange photo. I remember clearly that this photo was not in my collection. It was a photo of me, lying on my bed, eyes closed, face looking tired, but also calm. The angle was almost very low, right under the edge of the bed, just a few centimeters from my face. At first, I thought it was a prank from a friend, or maybe I accidentally took the photo while I was sleeping. But I couldn't remember doing it. I deleted it without thinking about it, just thinking that maybe I accidentally activated the camera while I was sleeping. But the next day, the photo appeared again. This time, it was even stranger. The photo was still of me sleeping, but this time, the angle was closer. The feeling of the photo was very wrong, like someone was standing very close to me while I was sleeping, so close that I could feel their breath. I started to feel uneasy. That feeling spread inside me, as if someone was watching me, lurking in the dark. I checked my phone more carefully, looking for apps and software that could do this, but found nothing unusual. I even changed my phone password, changed the security settings. But then, the strange thing happened again. That night I tried to go to bed later, hoping that there wouldn't be any more photos in the morning. The next day, when I woke up, there was another photo. This time it was of my face, so close to me as I slept that I could see the smallest details of my face, the lines of my skin, the dark circles under my eyes, and even the way my eyelids were slightly furrowed. It was such a detailed photo. I couldn't imagine how someone could have been standing so close to me without me knowing. Now, the anxiety had turned to fear. I felt like there was a presence that was always near me, but I couldn't see it. It wasn't something I could touch or hear, but it was there. I decided to try to find out if someone could have taken these photos without me knowing. I checked the camera app and all the photo-related apps on my phone, but everything was fine. There was no sign that someone was accessing my phone without permission. When I shared the story with a close friend named Ben, he just laughed and told me that it was probably stress. Everything would be fine. Ben was the only person I really trusted, and I also told myself that maybe I was imagining things. But then one night, while I was sitting in my apartment working, my phone suddenly vibrated. I looked at the screen, not believing my eyes. It was a photo, but this time, it wasn't me sleeping. It was a photo of my window, taken from outside, through the glass. It was a clear photo, and I hadn't opened the window last night. A cold feeling washed over me. Someone was standing outside, taking a picture of my room. Suddenly, I no longer felt safe in my own home. These photos may have been random, but the truth is, I couldn't ignore what had happened. Each photo got closer, clearer. and the photographer, perhaps, was standing right next to me when I didn't know. The next day, I decided not to sleep anymore. I stayed up all night, sitting in the dark, watching my phone and my room. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I just knew I couldn't go on living like this. And then, when the light of day came through the window, I couldn't believe my eyes. On my phone, there was another photo. This time, it was a photo of me from the dark, a photo clearer than ever. And in that photo, I could see not only my face, but also the faint silhouette of someone standing behind me, someone leaning over me, as if they were taking a picture of me as I sat there, right now. I dropped my phone, my hands shaking. The fear was no longer just anxiety. I began to think that maybe I was being watched not just from afar, but in my own home. And I didn't know what I could do to escape this. The truth was, I couldn't live in fear forever. But right now, I realized one thing. I was no longer in control of my life. I couldn't go on living like this. The pictures kept coming every morning, as if someone was standing right next to me, watching me every minute and every second without me even realizing it. I felt like a hunted prey, and each picture was a sign that the hunter was getting closer, waiting to strike. That day, I decided that I couldn't just sit and wait anymore. I had to do something, find a way to stop this fear. I called Ben, hoping he would help me understand what was going on. But I didn't want to worry him, so I just told him that I didn't feel right, that I needed help. Ben, as always, was my comforting friend. He offered to come see me, and together we could figure something out. Ben came to my house that afternoon, carrying a set of tools he had borrowed from a tech store. He said he might check my phone to see if there was any software that could access it without my knowledge. As he sat down at his desk and began checking my security settings, I felt a little relieved. At least I wasn't doing it all alone. You can try looking for software or apps that you haven't downloaded, Ben said, as he checked my phone for any strange apps. There might be a malicious app that got installed without you knowing. I watched him work, feeling nervous, but looking for anything unusual made me feel like I was doing something about the situation. He checked the phone's source code, deleted any unknown software, and reinstalled the operating system. He also checked for tracking software, apps that had access to my camera and location. You should also change all your important passwords, Ben continued. Not just your phone password, but your email and social media accounts. Just be a little cautious. I listened to him and changed everything. My feeling at that moment, although somewhat relieved, was still unsettling. There seemed to be something mysterious behind the photos I had seen. Something inexplicable. After Ben left, I decided to take a walk to dispel my fear. My apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, not too far from the city center, where I could easily find a quiet space to think. Unfortunately, something strange happened as soon as I left the apartment. As I was walking down the deserted street, my phone suddenly vibrated. A new message. It was a photo. I froze in the middle of the street, not daring to look at the screen right away. A vague fear gripped me, but I finally picked up my phone. And that photo? This time, it was a photo of the street I was standing on, viewed from behind me. In the photo, a black car was speeding by, but strangely, there was no driver. The chill I felt from that photo was hard to describe. It was as if, for a brief moment, I had been secretly photographed without my knowledge. And what made me panic even more was the fact that I was being watched from a very close distance, invisibly. I rushed home, my heart pounding. There was only one thought in my head. How can I escape from this person? Can I live in this fear forever? I opened the door, slammed it shut, and sat on the floor, gasping for breath. A terrible question arose in my mind. If this photographer knew me so well, did he know where I was right now? The picture became more and more haunting. Not only was I the only one being followed, but there was also a presence that seemed to know my every move, even my thoughts. This couldn't be a coincidence. I could feel it. The next morning, I decided to do something I didn't want to do. I called the police. After a moment of hesitation, I gave them all the pictures and what had happened. The police on the other end of the line listened to my story, their eyes filled with suspicion. I understand how you feel, but this could be a prank or a misunderstanding, the police officer replied. We'll check it out, but unless there's a clear sign of foul play, we can't intervene. The police officer's words were like a bucket of cold water thrown at me. It seemed like they didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. I felt like I was being abandoned in my own fear. That evening, as I sat in my living room, my phone rang again. This time, not a photo but a text message. I'm right behind your window. My heart sank. Hurriedly, I stood up and ran to the window. The street lights cast long shadows on the buildings, but other than the passing cars, I could see nothing. It seemed like there was no one out there, but the text message remained on my phone screen, as if he was playing tag with me. I locked all the doors, closed all the windows, but still couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my heart. I didn't know if I would be able to sleep again, but I was sure of one thing. It was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling. The nightmares that had been happening all night had not only exhausted me, but also made me even more confused about the strange photos and scary messages I had received. I no longer felt safe in my apartment. Every step, every glance through the window, every sound from outside the door startled me. I felt like someone was always watching me, no matter where I was. I sat down at the dining table, carefully opening my phone. Anxiety weighed heavily on my every move. I couldn't wait any longer. Anyway, there was no other way. I had to find out the truth behind these photos. Find out who had made me live in this fear. When I opened my phone, I didn't expect to receive any more photos. But when I checked the photo folder, there was a new photo. It wasn't like the previous ones. This time, it was a photo of the room I was in. But what shocked me was the angle from the window. I don't remember when I opened the window, but in the photo, I saw a blurry figure standing outside, as if waiting for me to look in. My limbs started to shake. I looked around the room, but there was no one. I felt like I was being cornered. Things seemed to be getting worse every day. Not only were there strange photos, but now the photographer could watch me from the outside. It felt like a trap with no way out. Unable to bear it any longer, I decided to do something bold. I would find out who took these photos. I would confront him. I needed to know who he was and why he did this to me. I began checking every corner of the room, from the smallest nook to the window, hoping to find some trace that could help me. As I was busy checking, my phone vibrated again. This time it was a text message. I found you. The sentence, short but enough to make me shiver. My heart pounded. I quickly tapped the screen to reply, but my hands were shaking so much that I couldn't type. Then suddenly, there was a knock on the door. I stood frozen for a moment. It was none other than the one knocking on my door. A cold feeling enveloped me. I could hear my own heavy breathing in the quiet, tense space. Who could be out there at this hour? With each step, my heart beat faster. I couldn't believe my eyes, but something inside me told me that I couldn't open the door. I couldn't face what was waiting for me outside. Yet, a strange feeling seemed to push me to open the door, as if there was an invisible force that I couldn't resist. I grabbed the doorknob and pulled it open. Behind the door was no one. I looked into the hallway, only to see thick darkness. No one in sight. But when I looked down, I noticed something strange. An old phone was lying on the ground, right under the door. I bent down to pick it up. It was a phone I didn't recognize. It was old and looked like it had been used for a long time. I flipped it open and immediately saw a new photo. It was me, standing right next to the door when I opened it. It felt like my whole body was paralyzed. The only question in my mind was, where is he? I turned back to the room, feeling like someone was watching me every step of the way. I tried to control my breathing, but I couldn't. This photo was another signal. The photographer was close, too close, and I couldn't tell where he was hiding. I rushed outside with no choice but to seek help. I called Ben, knowing he wouldn't be able to help much, but at least someone would be by my side. While waiting for him to arrive, I decided not to go back to the apartment. I wandered the streets, but then, as I passed a deserted alley, I received another text message from the phone that had been left at the door. Don't go. My limbs went limp. That feeling, as if this person could follow me at any time, anywhere, began to make me lose my mind. I looked around, but saw no one. The atmosphere around me became heavier, more terrible when I felt that I was not alone. As I continued walking, I felt a faint light from behind, as if someone was moving quickly through the buildings. I stopped, turned around, but there was no one. It was pitch black again, and fear spread through me. Ben called me at that moment. He said he was on his way to meet me. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the feeling of unease could not be appeased. This person, the one taking the picture on my phone, would definitely not stop. He would not stop until I faced him. I knew this war had only just begun. I couldn't understand what was happening. Every step I took, every move I made, it felt like someone was watching me. When I opened the door to my apartment, it felt different. Like everything around me was changing every second. The photographer, who had been following me all this time, was no longer just a ghost on the phone, but a real threat. Ben came to my house around 3 in the afternoon, while I was still lost in my thoughts. I told him about the old phone I found on my doorstep and the increasingly strange pictures. Ben nodded as I spoke, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He didn't say anything for a while, then finally said, "Do you think it could be some kind of prank from an old friend or someone from the past? Or someone is playing a trick on you?" I shook my head. "It's not a joke, Ben. You don't understand. This feeling is so real, so scary. Every morning I wake up. I see a new photo. No one could take a photo of me while I was sleeping without me knowing. And now, I found this phone. Maybe someone has been following me for a long time. Ben looked at me for a moment, then ran a hand over his face. Okay, if it's not a joke, then we'll have to figure something out. You need to call the police. Maybe they can help you. I didn't answer right away. Even though Ben was right, I knew that the police wouldn't be able to do anything with just vague photos and messages like this. What I needed wasn't an official investigation, but a way to protect myself, to know who was following me and why. After Ben left, I sat in the living room, my eyes glued to my phone. I decided I would not let myself succumb to this fear. I would find answers. Things could not go on like this. That evening, I carefully checked every room in the apartment. From the bathroom to the hidden corners of the bedroom, I checked thoroughly, hoping to find some trace that I had missed before. When everything was done, I felt a little relieved. At least I could still control my apartment, even though I could not control what was happening outside. Suddenly, my phone vibrated again. This time it was not a photo but a text message. I opened the message, and my eyes were immediately glued to the screen. "I'm standing outside your door." Fear struck again, making me unable to breathe. My heart was pounding, but I still tried to calm down. This time, I decided to do something I had been avoiding for a long time. I would open the door and face that person. Holding the phone in my hand, I walked out of the living room and towards the door. At this point, I could feel every step I took as a preparation for the inevitable confrontation. As I stood in front of the door, my hands were shaking as I held the doorknob. But I knew I couldn't back down anymore. I slowly opened the door. There was no one. Only the pale yellow lights from the surrounding buildings illuminated the area in front of the door. No one was standing there. But when I looked down at the ground, I saw something strange again. A phone, exactly like the one I had found before. But this time, the phone was right outside my door, within my line of sight. I didn't understand why it was there, but when I bent down to pick it up, a new photo appeared on the screen. This time, the photo wasn't of me anymore. It was a picture of my apartment, but from a different angle. It was a picture taken through the window, from outside. What terrified me the most was that it wasn't just the room. It had a silhouette standing silently in the corner, just below the dim light of the street lamp. I couldn't breathe. Who was standing there? How could someone take a picture of me without me knowing? Had I been followed before I realized it? I was starting to feel tired and helpless. I couldn't run away forever. I couldn't live in this fear anymore. I called Ben, and he could hear the panic in my voice that I couldn't hide. "Ben, I don't know what to do. I saw a silhouette outside the window. I don't know what to do." My voice was tight, like everything inside me had shattered. "Don't worry," Ben reassured me. "I'll be right there. Wait for me." I hung up and walked back to the room, hoping that everything would be okay. But I knew this wouldn't end well. The next photo might be of me, and I might not get another chance to tell this story. Story 4. Shadow. Outside the 20th floor window. I used to think that horror stories were just products of imagination. Scary games to make people shiver on lonely nights. But since I moved into the apartment on the top floor of the Skyview building, I have understood that there are things in life that we should never joke about. At first, everything was just familiar peace. The apartment I rented was spacious, with windows overlooking the entire city. The lights flickered on the streets like small fires, undulating in the dark. From the 20th floor, I could see the crowded neighborhoods, the highways crisscrossing like streams of cars. Regardless of day or night, the atmosphere here was quiet, and that was why I loved it. An ideal place to get away from the noisy life outside. In the early days of living here, I only heard the normal sounds of a city that never sleeps. Traffic, honking, people laughing from bars and shops. But after a while, there was another sound. A strange sound that I couldn't explain. At 3 in the morning, when everything was quiet, I began to hear soft, regular knocks, as if someone were tapping on the front door of my apartment. I remember very clearly the first time I heard it. It wasn't like someone pounding on a door, looking for attention. It was very light, like a finger lightly touching the door. At first I thought I was just hearing things, that it was just the wind or the sounds of the house. But no, when I heard it again the next night, and the night after that, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat up, my eyes still blurry from the broken sleep. I didn't know why, but I could feel the tension spreading in the room. My mind raced to the most logical possibilities. Maybe someone from inside the building was in the hallway, knocking on the door, and I couldn't hear them. But when I looked through the peephole, all I could see was darkness outside. No one was standing outside my door. The strange feeling kept nagging at me, but I convinced myself it was just the imagination of someone who lived alone. I turned off the light and went back to bed, trying to sleep. But the knocking continued, steady as a ghostly song, echoing through the night, and then it didn't stop at the front door. The knocking, on another night, had moved into my bedroom, into my window. And this time, I couldn't explain it. My bedroom window was on the 20th floor, a place I didn't think anyone could climb up to. I sat up, my hand shaking as I reached for the phone to call the police. But then I thought about the possibility that it was just someone playing a prank. Still, the fear wouldn't go away. I didn't know what to do, so I just sighed and tried to shake off the tension, telling myself that I had to sleep. But that didn't happen. The silence of the room was broken by another sound. This time not from the door, but from outside the hallway. Footsteps, light but very clear steps, as if someone was walking past my door. I couldn't think anymore, just felt an overwhelming fear waiting to overwhelm me. It felt as if someone was watching me, and I couldn't seem to escape their presence. The next morning, I decided to go out to investigate. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed a few strange things. The feeling that someone might be nearby, watching me, made me even more uneasy. I stopped in front of the elevator, wondering if anyone was watching me through the glass, or if I could get out without being followed. And then, a man appeared, someone I had never seen before. He stood at the end of the hallway, as if he was waiting for me. For just a brief moment, I saw his eyes, a mysterious gaze, and a vague smile that I could not explain. He just stood there, looking at me silently. A strange feeling filled me, as if he did not belong here. I left that building, left my apartment, unable to shake off the fear, and I never looked back. This story is true, and whether I tell it or not, it doesn't matter. The only thing I learned from all this is, sometimes there are things in life that you cannot explain, And if you're lucky or unlucky, you will never see them again. And the knock on the door in the middle of the night, I will never forget it. The feeling of not being able to shake off that fear followed me all day. After the strange event last night, I couldn't think of anything but the knocking on the door and the shadow at the end of the hallway. I couldn't explain what had happened. The feeling was haunting me, making it impossible to concentrate on work or anything else. But what was scarier was the appearance of that man. He wasn't just a stranger. He was a presence I couldn't understand. I decided not to go back to the apartment. That building, that long, quiet, cold hallway, was like an entrance to another world that I didn't want to set foot in again. But life wasn't that easy, and I still needed a place to stay, a place to continue my life. Even though it felt like I could never truly escape what had happened, I rented another apartment. My new apartment was not on the top floor like before, but on the 5th floor of an older building. But at least it made me feel safer. However, from the moment I entered, I had the feeling that I was not the only one living here. It was not a paranoid feeling, but a different feeling. A cold, heavy feeling, as if there was an invisible presence lurking somewhere in this space. This apartment was smaller, but at least I could create a quiet space for myself. I thought I could start over, try to forget the strange events that had happened before, and live a peaceful life as before. But I was wrong. The first few nights, nothing happened. I slept well and was not awakened by strange noises. However, after a few days, I started to hear noises again. The knocks were soft, like the ones I heard in my old apartment. But this time, they came from my bedroom door. I could even hear footsteps outside my window, as if someone was standing there. I tried looking through the window, but there was nothing. This apartment was on the 5th floor, and no one could climb up there. I called the building security, but they just said it was probably the wind or noise from the surrounding apartments. I didn't believe them. No one could understand what I was feeling. My stress was getting worse, and last night was a testament to that. At 3 in the morning, I heard the knocks again, but this time it didn't stop there. The knocks came from my bedroom, then from the window, and finally from the front door. The noise echoed throughout the room as if it were everywhere. But when I looked through the peephole, there was no one. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't live in this apartment anymore. I decided to leave this place, leave everything behind, leave what had happened behind. But as I was about to step out the door, I saw a figure standing right outside the door, exactly like the shadow I had seen before, the shadow of the man from the old apartment. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. That man stood there, in the darkness, just a few steps away from me. His eyes were glittering in the night, and his smirk made me shiver. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight. He didn't say anything, just stood there, looking at me with a challenging gaze. Before I could react, he slowly walked towards me. My legs felt paralyzed, unable to move. He came closer, and I could feel my breath mixing with the cold air in the room. As he approached, I felt a strong pull from within, as if he were controlling me from a distance. I was no longer in control of my body, as if I was being sucked into another world. Suddenly, I fell backwards, not knowing why I fell. When I raised my head, the man was gone. The door to the apartment was wide open, and I felt like I had just woken up from a bad dream. However, I knew I couldn't just ignore all of this. I struggled to stand up, my hands shaking as I reached for the phone in my pocket. I called the police, but no one answered. Everything around me was like a fog, unclear and vague. The room was empty, no one was there. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the window. I felt like I had fallen into a world I couldn't escape from. When I turned to look through the window, I saw that figure again. He stood right in the hallway, but this time, he didn't look at me. He just stared into space, as if waiting for someone. I didn't dare to approach, didn't dare to do anything. I just stood there, looking at him, feeling like I was trapped in a spiral that I couldn't escape from. By the time I decided to open the door, the man had disappeared. There was only darkness and a strange coldness that enveloped me. I knew that I couldn't continue living like this, and there was only one thing I was sure of. I couldn't escape. The shadow of that man had followed me all the way here, all the way to this apartment, and I'm no longer the only one aware of his presence. Story 5. The Twin. A cold wind blew through the city on an October evening. I stepped off the bus, tired after a long day of working at a coffee shop. Nothing special, except for a quiet afternoon like any other. I still remember the chilly feeling of the air around me as I walked on the empty street. The dim street lights casting long shadows on the road. I liked walking home on days like that, for no particular reason, simply because I liked the feeling of being alone in this city. I lived in an apartment on the third floor of an old building where not many people paid attention. The surrounding houses all seemed to be quietly falling asleep, but I did not feel lonely. I liked this quietness, a little space for myself after the noisy hours of work. As I walked through the building gate, a man suddenly approached me from the other side of the street. I didn't notice at first, but as he got closer, I heard his light footsteps echoing in the air. He looked at me, his eyes fixed as if he had something to say, but he didn't say anything. "Hello?" he said, smiling strangely. "Long time no see, huh?" I stopped, frowning slightly. How did he know me? I couldn't remember ever seeing him before. "Excuse me, who are you?" I asked, feeling a little uncomfortable that he was still standing right in front of me. He just smiled slightly, then shook his head, as if trying to remember something in his mind. "Oh, it's okay. You seem busy. Bye." And then he turned and walked away quickly. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I had just gone through a confusing situation. But when I looked back, he had disappeared into the darkness. I must have been too tired, and my mind was in turmoil. The next day, I encountered a similar situation. This time, it was at a convenience store near my house. While I was standing in line, a woman with long hair and jet black eyes walked up to me and stared at me. "Hello? Long time no see," she said, smiling brightly. But this time, I didn't feel uncomfortable, but instead a cold feeling rose from the bottom of my heart. "Sorry, I don't remember meeting you before," I said, my voice a little off. She just looked at me for a long time and then lowered her head. "Ah, I must have been wrong. It's nice to see you anyway." I felt like something was wrong. This person, her, I didn't remember meeting her before. Why did they talk to me as if we were old friends? A sense of unease began to creep into every corner of my mind. That night I returned home in an uncomfortable mood. This feeling stuck with me all day. as if someone was watching me. Strange faces haunted me, as if they knew me, but I didn't remember them. Laughter and familiar words echoed in my head, but I couldn't place them. When I opened the door to my apartment, a strange feeling came over me. The room was the same as usual, but something was different. It felt like someone had been there. I don't know why, but last night I didn't remember turning off all the lights in the living room. I went out to the hallway to check, but there was nothing. My apartment was always clean. Nothing had changed, but when I returned to the living room, I saw something new on the table. An old photo, face down. I picked it up and looked closely. It was a black and white photo of a group of people standing together. I didn't recognize anyone in the photo, but there was something that stunned me. The woman in the photo looked exactly like me. Not a normal resemblance, but a resemblance so perfect that I couldn't believe it. I didn't know what to do. I felt dizzy. My whole body was cold. How could there be someone who looked so much like me? What was going on? The feeling of unease grew, and I couldn't stop looking at the photo. The next day, I went to work as usual, but I couldn't get the photo out of my mind. When I left the cafe, I unexpectedly ran into the man from yesterday, this time standing near a corner and looking at me. He smiled as if he had expected me to pass by. "You look tired today," he said, his voice full of concern. "Maybe you didn't sleep well last night?" My head felt like it was spinning. How did he know I didn't sleep well last night? I felt like I was being watched, but when I looked around, everything was normal. I couldn't figure it out. "Sorry, I don't understand what you're saying," I replied, but my voice was uncertain. He just smiled and walked away. When I got home, I decided to check the security cameras in my apartment. It was hard to believe, but I saw something I couldn't explain. In the videos of me entering my house, there was a person who looked exactly like me, down to the last detail, entering my apartment every night. So much like me that it couldn't be a coincidence. I can't take it anymore. There's someone just like me, living another life, and I don't know who they are. Why is there someone so similar to me? And why don't I know anything about this? I don't know what to do. It's like a nightmare I can't wake up from. Unanswered questions haunt me. Am I really living my own life? Or is it all just a game? And I'm the one who's being fooled. I couldn't sleep all night. The images kept spinning in my head, replaying over and over again, drawing unanswered questions. The woman in the photo looked exactly like me. And then, there was someone coming into my house every night. Someone who looked exactly like me. I didn't know what to make of these strange things. The next morning, I decided to see a close friend, Lisa, whom I trusted the most to share these things with. Lisa was the only one who could help me clear my head, make me forget the invisible fears that were haunting my mind. I called her early in the morning, and she agreed to meet me immediately. We sat in our usual coffee shop, where the noise of New York City created a bustling atmosphere, a complete contrast to the confusion I was feeling. "What's wrong, Sarah? You look tired," Lisa said, her eyes fixed on me. I couldn't hide the worry in my eyes. I took a sip of coffee, the cold feeling in my heart that wouldn't go away. I don't know what to do, Lisa. I think I'm losing my mind." Lisa was silent, waiting for me to continue. I saw a photo. an old photo in my apartment, and someone who looked exactly like me, was coming into my house every night. Lisa didn't say anything right away. She just looked at me seriously, like she didn't understand the whole story. But then, her voice spoke, soft but direct. "Have you checked the security cameras?" I nodded, my hands shaking as I recalled the images in the video. I checked, and there was someone who looked exactly like me, coming into my house every night. But it wasn't me. Lisa sat still, her expression unchanged. "You must have thought it was just a coincidence. You can't worry too much about things that can't be explained." But I knew I couldn't go on living like this. It felt like someone was replacing me in this life, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. A deep fear was growing inside me. "That's not all, Lisa. I met a stranger yesterday. They said they met me in places I'd never been before. They talked as if I'd met them before, and they knew me from before. I can't forget those encounters." Lisa was silent for a moment. Then she asked, "Are you sure, Sarah? You can't let fear control you. You have to find a way to face it." I couldn't explain that feeling to her. How could I tell her that I felt like I was being replaced? How could I explain the fear that I couldn't control? That night I returned home, my heart still heavy with doubts. The feeling of unease still haunted me, as if something were following me in the darkness. When I opened the door to my apartment, a sudden blast of cold air made me shiver. The lights in the room were still on, but there was something unusual. I walked through the living room, and suddenly I stopped. A large mirror was placed on the table, reflecting my image. But when I looked more closely, I realized that the reflection was not me. It was an image of a woman with a face exactly like mine. But her eyes, the eyes of the person in the mirror, were empty. She looked at me menacingly, and the smile on her lips was somewhat contemptuous. My feelings were frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I turned around and ran towards the door. I couldn't look at that mirror anymore. But when I turned around, I heard footsteps. Footsteps came from behind me. I turned around, and this time I saw nothing. The room was empty. Everything was silent. I ran out the door, not daring to look back, not daring to face my apartment again. The next day, I went to work with a heavy heart. It was as if something was watching me all the time, everywhere. Every step, every breath made me feel like I was sinking into a nightmare that I couldn't escape. While I was working, a text message suddenly appeared on my phone from an unknown number. I didn't remember receiving this call. I opened the message. "You still don't recognize me?" I felt my heart stop. How did they know what I was doing, where I was? How did they know what I was thinking, what I felt? But then the next text message came right after. "I'll see you tonight." A feeling of panic rose within me. I couldn't keep calm anymore. Who was this person? And why were they following me? This question had no answer, and it only made me more confused and scared than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. That night I decided not to go home. I couldn't go back to that apartment, where I felt like I was no longer myself. I wandered the streets, aimless, without direction. Everything around me seemed to have no meaning to me anymore. Why was I the only one who had to endure this obsession? And the others, do they know what's going on? My footsteps stopped in front of a small alley. A car was parked there, driverless. And then, from the darkness, a voice rang out. "You're not the only one, Sarah." I turned around, but I couldn't see the person's face clearly. The street lights were dim, but that voice was so familiar. I had never heard it before, but it felt so familiar. I ran, but I didn't know where to run. Everything around me seemed to want to swallow me up in the darkness, and I couldn't escape. Once again, I felt like I was being watched. I can't stop anymore. The ghosts in my memories keep haunting me. I'm starting to feel like I'm living in a nightmare that I can't wake up from. It feels like someone is watching me from the shadows, like an invisible shadow that clings to me, no matter how hard I try to escape. Last night, I couldn't sleep. Strange images kept flashing through my head, making me feel extremely scared after the strange events that happened one after another. I'm starting to feel like I'm no longer in control of my own life. It feels like someone else is living for me, replacing me in every little detail of my daily life. The woman in the photo, who strangely resembles me, has now become an inescapable ghost in my mind. Last night, I did what I've always tried to avoid. I went back to my apartment. Yes, I went back there, even though I didn't want to. I knew I had to do this if I didn't want to be completely confused. When I opened the door to the apartment, I felt the coldness and the presence of something inexplicable again. The room was the same, but my feelings about it had changed completely. This time, I decided to examine everything more closely. I started in the living room, where I had seen the strange photo before. I looked back at the table, and the strange feeling came over me again. The photo was still there, but I didn't see the woman who looked like me in it anymore. Instead, I could only see the darkness in the glass of the photo. Something was definitely wrong. I looked around the room, looking for any sign. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly as I had left it. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had entered my apartment. As I moved toward the kitchen, a soft sound came from the window. I paused, straining to hear better. And then I saw a figure standing outside the window, hidden behind the curtains. My heart was pounding. I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure stood still, not moving, but I could feel their presence, like my shadow was standing there, staring at me. I couldn't control my body, but I knew what I had to do. I had to get out of here. I turned and ran to the front door, but when I opened it, a strange laugh rang out from the darkness. A laugh I had never heard before. It was a dry, haunting sound. I turned and ran into the bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. My heart was pounding, as if it were about to burst out of my chest. I gasped, unable to find a rational reason for what had just happened. It felt like someone had been here for a long time, and I'd only just realized it. I leaned against the bedroom door, feeling tired. But when I turned my head, I saw something strange on the bed. A small shiny mirror lying on the blanket. I had never left that mirror here. And once again, I felt the coldness in the air. That mirror looked at me like a window to another world. Unable to bear it any longer, I decided to check the apartment's security camera again. I had to find out the truth. The feeling of dread in me was like a tidal wave, pulling me into chaotic thoughts. I opened the app and started to review the videos recorded from the previous nights. And then I saw something that made me unable to breathe. The scene that appeared on the screen The mirror in the living room was like a mysterious door. I saw the shadow of a person entering my apartment, and it was not me. It was a woman with a face like mine, but different. She walked in as if she had been there all along, as if she owned the apartment. My eyes widened. That feeling, this person's presence in my apartment, made me feel invaded, displaced. She stood there, looking at the screen, and I could see her eyes staring at me through the camera. It was a look I had never seen on anyone. A cold, lifeless gaze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I turned around, feeling like everything around me was spinning. The space in the apartment seemed to shrink, as if I was trapped in a space I couldn't escape from. I didn't know what to do. A feeling of helplessness welled up inside me, and unanswered questions invaded my mind. I decided not to look back at the camera anymore. I couldn't bear it. But when I turned and walked out of the bedroom, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. The woman appeared again, standing right in front of me. She looked at me calmly, as if we had known each other for a long time. There was no fear in her eyes, only understanding, as if we were sharing a great secret that I could not explain. "Hello, Sarah," she said, her voice soft, as if she had known me for a long time. "Finally, we meet again." Those words hit me like a blow to the head. I felt like everything around me was collapsing. Who was this person? Who was she? And why was she talking as if we'd met before? I couldn't answer. Everything inside me was frozen. I just stood there, looking at her, and a cold feeling rose from deep within me. Story 6. Cold Eyes. No one had been back to our house for a long time. My father had passed away a few years ago, and since then I had no reason to return to that old house. My mother had also moved to live near my sister, and I had buried myself in work trying to forget the memories and the deceased relatives. But then, one day, when I received a call from a real estate broker, I realized that I could not avoid the truth. The old house needed to be sold, no matter how much I wanted to avoid it, no matter how much I wanted to forget it. Everything had to be resolved. That day, I returned to the house after many years. The old walls, the time-worn tables and chairs, and the family photos on the wall all made me feel like I had returned to a bygone world. I stood at the door, smelling the old wood, the damp earth, and the silence of the house. This feeling was no different from what I experienced when I was a child, when my family and I lived here. The quiet evenings with the sound of the wind whistling outside the window. When I entered the living room, I looked around, feeling that everything was familiar, but also like it had never been mine. The objects were still the same, although the dust had thickened. The feeling of strangeness gradually enveloped me. I walked through the dining room, where the dining table still had stains from not being cleaned for a long time, where my parents and I often gathered together to eat and chat. The family pictures were still hanging on the wall. Only now they looked different, more unfamiliar. What I couldn't stop looking at was the small table in the corner of the room, where our family photos were displayed. When I was a child, I often sat here, looking at the photos of my parents, me and my sisters, on holidays, long trips, and happy moments in life. Those photos, perhaps taken a dozen years ago, still feel very vivid to me. Every time I look at them, I feel like time has not passed. Those moments remain forever. I sat down carefully flipping through each photo, as if I wanted to find a part of a forgotten memory. The smiles on my parents' faces, the warm eyes of my grandmother, and the innocent smiles of my sister and I, all of them appeared clearly in my mind. I felt a little warmth in my heart, as if this house was still alive, still had a little breath of the years gone by. But when I flipped to the family photo, taken on Christmas when I was 15, I began to feel something was wrong. I stopped, staring at the photo. The faces in the photo were still familiar, but there was one detail that I had never noticed before. In the photo next to my father, there was a man. He was not a family member, not a friend or acquaintance. I must have seen this photo hundreds of times, but I could not remember who this man was. At first I thought I was seeing things, but when I looked closely, I saw that he was standing very close to my father. Too close to be someone who happened to appear in the photo. He stood there, not smiling, just looking straight into the lens. A cold, distant gaze. An indescribable feeling suddenly came over me. How could there be a stranger there that I did not remember? I flipped through the photos, and then I realized something horrifying. That man kept appearing in each photo, standing closer to my father, as if he were moving closer to us over the years. The first was the photo of the summer picnic. He was standing right next to my father, just a few steps away. Next was a photo taken at a Christmas party. He stood next to my mother, looking at the camera. I had never seen him in my mother's stories, nor had I ever heard anyone mention his name. And then, the last photo, taken right after I was born, in the hospital. He was in that one too. But what sent a chill down my spine was the change in his eyes from photo to photo. Every time I looked at it, I felt like he was looking at me. Not just in the photo, but as if from reality, from somewhere closer. A feeling of dread rose within me, impossible to shake off. I began to feel as if I was being watched, not just in the photos, but in this space where I had grown up. Perhaps I was imagining things, but the feeling was too strong for me to ignore. Before I could think further, I heard a slight noise from behind me, like a sigh, faintly in the silence. Not my family, because my mother and sister were not there. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to have darkened, and the old family photo was now not just a memory, but a warning. I told myself to stay calm, but something was clearly wrong. There was something in this house that I did not fully understand. Since then, I couldn't stop thinking about the photos and the strange man in them. I tried to act calm, to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something very strange was going on. Something I didn't understand. My mother still called me every day, asking about work, about life. She had no idea what I was going through, because I never mentioned feeling unsafe in the old house. She always thought I was exaggerating, but I couldn't just ignore those strange signs. That night, as I continued to lie on the old bed in my room, I heard sounds from somewhere in the house. Cracking sounds, as if someone was moving in the living room. I assumed it was just the old wood panels in the house creaking. This house had been uninhabited for a long time. Everything could make strange sounds. But what kept me from sleeping was the inexplicable feeling that someone was standing right in the dark, watching me. I tried to bury my head in the pillow, thinking that if I didn't pay attention to them, the sounds would disappear. But that night was not like any other normal night. Every time I dozed off, I heard light, slow footsteps walking through the living room. When I opened my eyes, the light from the window only made the darkness in the room even more intense. It felt so strange. I wondered if I was being too nervous. But no, something was really wrong. I decided to find out more about those photos. The whole next day, I spent all my time rummaging through the living room, looking at each photo, hoping to find some clue. But no, the strange man kept appearing in the photos. He was there, at first standing close to my father. Then gradually he stood closer. Even in the last few photos, he was almost beside me. As I was flipping through the photos in the album, my eyes suddenly stopped at another photo. This was a family photo that I had never seen before. In this photo, my father and mother stood in the middle of the garden, holding hands. But the strange thing was, the strange man was not standing close to them. He was standing right behind my father. And this time, he was looking at the camera, but his eyes were not those of a random visitor. The feeling inside me grew stronger, as if he knew that I was looking at him, knew that I was trying to find out the truth. When I looked closer, I realized something that made me shiver. This photo was taken right after I was born. At that time, I was just a baby, lying in my mother's arms. I had never seen this photo before, but there was this strange man with cold eyes standing right behind my father. I gasped, my mind spinning. How could he be in photos I had never seen? How could he appear in important family moments when I had no memory of him? At that moment, I felt a wave of fear roll over me. Unable to sit still any longer, I took out my phone and started calling my mother. I needed an explanation, a rational reason. My mother picked up immediately, her voice as gentle as ever. "Hello, what's wrong?" I tried to stay calm as I said, "Mom, what happened when you were little? Is there anyone in our family?" My mother paused for a moment, seemingly surprised by my question. "What are you talking about? Surely you don't remember? I always tell you about the happy memories from when you were little." I could hear her sigh through the phone, but she didn't say anything more. "I don't understand what you're asking. Can you ask again?" I bit my lip, feeling an indescribable unease. "Do you know about the man in the family photos?" She pondered, then replied, "Probably an old friend of your father's. I don't remember clearly, but your father had a lot of friends from the old days. Maybe they were photographed together on important occasions." I nodded, but couldn't shake the doubt in my heart. An old friend? But why did he appear in almost all of our important family photos, in moments when no one else was present but us? The anxiety grew. All day long, I couldn't concentrate on my work, couldn't get the pictures out of my head. Unanswered questions kept haunting me, and a strange, inexplicable feeling kept rising within me. Why didn't I remember him? Why did he appear in family photos that I couldn't explain? That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard the sound of the wind whistling outside the window. I lay still on the bed. The cold feeling from inside the house made it impossible for me to sleep. After a while, I suddenly heard a sigh from the living room, as if someone was standing there, staring at me. The fear inside me rose again, this time stronger than ever. I stood up, unable to keep calm anymore. When I entered the living room, the room was dark, only the light from the window shone in. I felt the uneasiness spread in the space. But there was no one in the room. Only the family photos still quietly hung on the wall. Everything was the same, but I felt as if I was being observed from somewhere, from the deep darkness. As I looked back at the last photo, I felt a cold wind pass by me. The footsteps were light, as if someone was approaching me, approaching this house, step by step. I couldn't get rid of those pictures, no matter how hard I tried. They kept replaying in my head, like a never-ending nightmare. That strange man, his cold face, didn't fade away, but instead appeared more clearly in my mind. Each picture was a piece of a puzzle that I couldn't fully understand, and I couldn't stop thinking about this. He was approaching me through each picture, through each moment in time. Just as I felt, his presence was not accidental. That night, after calling my mother and hearing unconvincing explanations, I decided to do what I thought I had avoided for too long. I went back to the old house again. After all, I couldn't run away from the past forever. I needed to know the truth. That day, I thought a lot about what had happened. The feeling of dread that the man was still somewhere in the house watching me was indescribable. It wasn't paranoia, but something very real, a presence that I couldn't explain. The house, the place where I grew up, had now become a place of fear. When I arrived, the atmosphere outside was somewhat heavy, as if even the space itself was evocative of anxiety. I entered the house, smelling the musty smell of old wood and the thick air, as if everything was waiting for something. Everything was the same. Nothing had changed, but I clearly felt that there was a difference. That feeling gradually spread through my body, as if an undercurrent was washing over me. This time, I didn't just rummage through the photos in the living room. I went everywhere, from the kitchen to the bedrooms, looking for anything that could explain these strange feelings. But the more I searched, the more I felt as if this house held memories that I couldn't explain. When I entered my parents' room, I saw that the family photos were still hanging on the wall, but not like last time. A photo I had never seen before suddenly caught my eye. It was a photo taken on Christmas when I was 10, an occasion I remembered clearly. Everyone was smiling, but the man in the photo was not smiling. He just stood there, silently, his eyes looking straight at the camera, but not in the friendly way of a friend. I felt the atmosphere in the room change immediately. I looked at the man's face, and I noticed something strange. He was not just a visitor. He had a presence, perhaps, from a long time ago that I had not known. I couldn't take my eyes off the photo, and the memories of my childhood seemed to be suffocated in my heart. A soft sound came from behind, like a sigh. I turned around, but there was no one. The room was silent again, just me and the photos. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this house. Everything seemed to be fading away, and I had the feeling that those photos weren't just moments from the past, but signs, messages that I didn't understand. I decided to go back to my bedroom, where I had slept so many nights during my childhood. But as soon as I entered, I felt a change. The bedroom was empty, but I felt the presence of someone in this space. I suddenly remembered a strange detail. When I was little, I always felt like someone was watching me every night. But now, the space was too quiet, too empty. The light from the small nightlight was weak, shining on the old bed, and I sat down. looking at the photo taken when I was first born. Seeing my parents, I felt a sadness rise again. But when I looked more closely, I noticed something I had never noticed before. In the photo, the man standing behind my father, once again, was not someone I knew. I felt a sense of fear rising in my chest. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Not my footsteps, but footsteps from outside the room, approaching me. I didn't dare to breathe heavily. My heart was pounding. My door was closed, but the air in the room became heavy, as if someone was standing right outside. I stood up, walked towards the door, but the footsteps had stopped. I opened the door, but saw no one. The house returned to an eerie silence. However, when I turned around, I saw a photo fall from the table. A photo that I didn't recognize. It was a photo of my parents with a man. But this time, the man was not only standing near my father, but was also looking at me through the photo, as if he were waiting for something. I felt myself caught in a strange world, between the past and the present, between the photos and the memories that I could not explain. Something was approaching, something I could not control. I felt like I was being pulled into something irrevocable, and that man, from the pictures, was getting closer, so close that I couldn't turn back. Story 7. The horrifying truth about room number 13. In the dormitory. That fall, I entered my sophomore year at Havens College. I was assigned to a new dormitory where my 3 best friends, Chris, Rachel, and John, shared a spacious room. The dormitory was built in the 80s, with long hallways and doors that seemed too old. But there was something both new and strange about it, making me unable to stop thinking. At first, when I checked in, everything was normal. Our room was numbered 13, a number that I found quite strange. The 4 of us laughed and joked, calling our room number unique. But in my heart, I couldn't help but wonder, was it just a simple coincidence, or was there something unusual? The dormitory seemed no different from any other. The rooms were all arranged exactly the same, with a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking the campus. The hallway in front of our room, 13, was normal. But as I walked out, down that hallway, I noticed something odd. Oddly enough, I didn't see room 13 anywhere other than our room. The entire hallway was lined with rooms numbered 1 through 12, with our room, room 13, at the end. At first, I thought it was just a mistake in the room numbers. Chris and I argued about it for a while, but neither of us could come up with a logical reason for the discrepancy. With such a long dormitory, how could there be a room number missing? Room 13 seemed to have been left out, as if the hallway wasn't designed for the 4 of us. The first day went by normally. We went to class, met new friends, and explored the campus. But that night, when we returned to our room after a long day, a strange feeling began to rise within me. Everyone in the room was silent, as if they sensed something was wrong. The first night I slept here, I couldn't sleep. As I tried to sleep, strange sounds came from the hallway outside. A few footsteps, as if someone was walking back and forth right in front of the door. I thought it was just people passing by, but then I noticed something even stranger. Every time I went out to look, I saw no one. The metal door at the end of the hallway was closed, with no sign of anyone. "Why are you just standing there?" Rachel asked when I returned to the room after a checkup. She didn't seem to care much about what was happening outside. To Rachel, it was probably just stress from studying. But the second night, The sounds came back, more clearly this time. Footsteps, whispers, even the sound of a door opening and closing. I couldn't take it anymore. When I opened the door and looked out, a figure suddenly flashed past me. I stood there for a long time, unable to understand what was happening. Was someone watching us? The next day, I decided to share my experience with John, who seemed more down to earth than the rest of us. He didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that. But as I described what I had seen and heard, his eyes gradually became serious. It could just be the normal noise in an old house, John said. But I could tell he was wondering too. We started to pay more attention to the details around us. On the third night, when I got out of bed and went out into the hallway, I noticed a damp spot on the door. It wasn't a trace of rain, but a damp spot that came from nowhere. I could only stand there, frightened, and then return to my room without daring to say anything. The next day, when we asked the dormitory manager about room 13, she answered strangely, as if she didn't remember anything. Ah, room 13. Yeah, it seems like there was some kind of construction accident, so it's still there. She spoke in a light voice, but her eyes quickly glanced at us, as if she didn't want to mention something again. Late one evening, while we were chatting in our room, there was a knock on the door. "Who is it?" I asked, but no one answered. John stood up to open the door, and there was no one there. We looked at each other, confused, but no one said anything more. From that day on, the uneasiness in me began to settle and accumulate, like a ghost that couldn't be chased away. The story of room 13 has begun to permeate each member of the group, each of us feeling something strange enveloping us. The sleepless nights, the inexplicable sounds, and the feeling that I can't describe. We still live here, in that strange room. But I know there are things that can never go back to the way they were. Room 13 is not a coincidence. It is waiting for us to step into a story that we can never escape. The footsteps in the night, the shadows lurking in the dark. Everything seems to have just begun. The fourth night in room 13 of the dormitory, everything seemed to no longer be a normal nightmare. We began to feel like there was something threatening every step we took. The feeling of suffocation enveloped the room, and the strange sounds were no longer the only things that made us afraid. Room 13 was not just a place where we lived, but it seemed to have become a part of the nightmares that we could not escape. It all started one evening when Rachel stood in front of the window and looked out. "Guys, did you see that? That shadow. That shadow." Her voice trembled, her eyes staring into space outside, as if she saw something strange. Chris and I both turned to look in the direction she pointed, but saw only the quiet night and the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing, just the wind. "What are you doing, Rachel?" John asked, unable to hide his worry. Rachel did not answer immediately. She just stood there, her hands trembling as she held onto the window frame, her eyes still glued to the darkness outside. "I don't know. I saw a shadow pass by, like a person. It didn't look like a tree. It just stood there and then disappeared." Chris chuckled, trying to lighten the tension. "You must be tired. You're mistaken. Don't worry. We're just students. It's nothing." But no matter how hard I tried to shake off my fear, I could still feel something cold hanging in the air. Things got even stranger when I started to hear small knocking sounds. Not the sound of someone standing outside, but the sound of someone tapping lightly on the wall on the other side of the room. It wasn't the first time, but this time I couldn't ignore it. What was going on in this room? I picked up the phone, automatically dialing 911, but I stopped before I pressed the call button. We had called the police earlier, and they had found nothing. It was simply a mechanical error or random occurrence. I couldn't make them believe such strange things. "Chris, did you hear anything?" I whispered. He nodded, his eyes already showing a little fear. "There's something knocking at the door." Rachel, now calmer, walked toward the door, her hand clutching the knob, her eyes scanning the room. "I don't know, but I can't take it anymore. I have to get out. I need air." She walked out of the room, and we stopped to look at each other. The darkness of the hallway seemed to close in on us. There was no sound. No one. All the doors were closed. All was quiet, except for an unnaturally cold breeze coming through the cracks in the windows. A few minutes later, Rachel returned, her face pale, her hands shaking. "You guys have to go out and see this. I can't explain it." We followed her one by one, no one saying anything, but all of us felt the unease spreading with every step. When we reached the hallway, something was immediately wrong. The hallway was dark, lit only by the dim light from the weak bulbs, but in the darkness, our room number 13 was the only one with a dim light coming from inside. The door was still closed. "What is this?" John muttered, his hand gripping mine tightly. His mouth unable to form any words. I couldn't say anything either. A heavy feeling, as if the air around me was condensing. A feeling of suffocation pressing down on my heart. Suddenly, the knocking sounded again, but this time it wasn't from our room. It came from the end of the hallway. The knocking was steady, short, but clear. A feeling of dread rose within me. I couldn't see anything but darkness. Rachel stood still, not daring to move. Who is that? The shadow at the end of the hallway flickered slightly in the dim light. It wasn't a person, but a strange, shapeless silhouette, as if someone was standing behind a black cloth. I couldn't see clearly, but the feeling of it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I turned to look at Rachel and John. What should we do now? John didn't say anything. He just pulled my hand and started walking quickly towards room 13. Rachel followed, her eyes not daring to leave the darkness. "This has to be some kind of prank, right?" Chris muttered, but his voice was uncertain. I opened the door and stepped inside. But what scared me was that the shadow had disappeared. The cold feeling in room 13 was more obvious than ever. Our desks were still full of books. The bed was still uncovered. Everything was normal. But I could feel that something was wrong. I walked to the window, opened it and looked out. It was pitch black outside, without a single star. Strangely, I couldn't see anything but the darkness. But there was a presence that I couldn't explain. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But Rachel shook her head, looking at me with worried eyes. "There's nowhere else to go. Something's with us." Just then, a shattering sound rang out. A sharp sound, like glass, breaking from some room outside. We all looked at each other, then ran out into the hallway, where the dim light shone on the ground. The hallway was different. The walls seemed to be tilted. The room suddenly felt strange. "What is this?" John shouted as the wall retreated, revealing a large gap. Inside was a dark room where everything was unlike anything we had seen before. And when I looked into it, I realized it was room 13, where we were in. But not now. "Run," I whispered. The door closed with a loud bang, sending us all back in panic. But no one wanted to look back. The next morning, nothing was the same. We, 4 young, enthusiastic students, were now just a group of confused, fearful people. None of us could remember exactly what happened last night, but the heavy feeling still hung over room 13, like a ghost that never left. When I woke up, a severe headache woke me up. It felt like my mind was being squeezed. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was about to burst. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying on the bed, still in room 13. But everything around me was strange. The objects in the room seemed to have changed. This room, with all the things I was familiar with, suddenly became different. I glanced towards the window, and I saw no sunlight. Not because it was still dark, but because the light seemed unable to penetrate the thick fog that covered the outside. A cold, thick mist covered the world like a blanket. Rachel was the first to wake up, sitting up quickly, but her eyes were still filled with confusion. Do you feel anything?" she asked, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't slept enough. I don't remember anything, but something is very wrong. John and Chris woke up later, but they were not their usual selves. They looked tired, but there was something cold in their eyes, like people who had just experienced a nightmare that they couldn't wake up from. None of us could understand what had happened last night, but one thing was clear. This room, or more precisely, this dormitory, was no longer a normal place. I could feel the difference as soon as I woke up. There was an eerie silence, as if every sound in this dormitory had been swallowed by an invisible darkness. There was no laughter, no chatter, no footsteps from other students, just an eerie silence. "We need to get out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anywhere, but don't stay here any longer." Rachel got up from the bed, her hands shaking, but she didn't protest. She just nodded, silent. John and Chris followed suit. We started to leave the room, no one speaking. The footsteps echoed, but there was no power, just silent steps in the dim space. I opened the door, and what I saw was a quiet hallway, but something strange. The hallway, seemingly endless, stretched out before me. The doors showed no signs of life, only darkness, as if everything had disappeared. With each step, the space around me seemed to shrink a little more. We stepped outside, but a strange feeling gripped us. We couldn't get out. The hallway continued on and on, like an invisible trap. "What's going on?" Chris whispered, his voice filled with concern. "What did we do wrong?" I couldn't answer him because I didn't understand either, but I felt like there was something waiting for us. An invisible presence, as if the doors in this dorm were staring at us. The strange thing was, there was no one else but us. Where were the other students? The laughter, the shrill conversations, all gone. The dorm seemed to be just the 4 of us. And this silence. Rachel stopped at a door at the end of the hallway. "Did we go the wrong way?" she asked. "It's not like we saw it before." I looked in the direction she was pointing. A door stood ajar in front of us, with a strange damp spot on the wall beside it. There was no number on the door, but it seemed to be part of this hallway. Strangely, I felt like I had seen this door before, like it had been here long before we had arrived. "This door isn't in the dormitory's blueprints," I said. "It doesn't seem to belong here." We stood there, neither of us wanting to open the door. But finally, as if by some invisible impulse, I stepped forward and pulled the door open. A cold wind hit me in the face. The door opened into a dark space with no sign of light. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something. A cold, damp air. "Let's go in," I said, though I didn't want to. But part of me knew there was no avoiding it any longer. We entered the room, and as soon as we crossed the threshold, a heavy feeling came over us. Not like the other rooms in the dormitory, where we felt unfamiliar but empty. A feeling as if something was watching us from all sides. There were no beds, no tables or chairs, just cold walls and a shadowy figure in the corner. We looked at each other, and suddenly the footsteps sounded again. They were not ours. They came from the back of the room. One step, two, three, each one heavy, as if someone were moving toward us. I felt a chill run down my spine. "It's not us," I whispered as my heart began to pound harder. There was a loud noise, as if something had broken in the room. A dark figure flashed at the back of the room. I couldn't see clearly, but I could feel the presence, almost waiting for us. We didn't dare move. For a moment, I felt like time had stopped, but then, as if by reflex, I took a step back and said nothing. A strange feeling enveloped me. Something, maybe light, maybe darkness, began to stretch and transform. The door suddenly closed, locking behind us. And then, I realized something more terrifying than ever. We had entered a place where there was no escape. That door 13 was not just a number, but a curse. The door slammed shut behind us, leaving a large, dark space, as if the room was no longer part of our world. None of us dared to speak. Only the heavy breathing of the four of us echoed in the empty room. Everything was too quiet, and that made the air even heavier, like something was lurking in the darkness. I didn't know what to do. The feeling of being trapped in this room was driving me crazy. All four of us, unable to speak, as if our throats were clogged with something invisible. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything but the thick darkness. It seemed that every step in this room was heavy, like stepping into another dimension, where time and space were no longer the same. "We need to get out now." Rachel finally spoke, but her voice was no longer the voice I knew. It was off, hoarse and echoing, as if it were dragging through the space. "The door won't open," Chris replied. "Has he tried to pull it open?" "No, nothing's changed." I looked into John's eyes, and I knew he felt the same way. Every step we took was audible in the silence. The walls of the room seemed to be pressing in on us, making the space feel even smaller, making me feel like I was being suffocated. "No," I whispered. "We can't get out." The group stood still, all of us feeling something around us, enveloping us in this space. Something was watching us, and I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just fear in our hearts, but an invisible presence that was slowly enveloping everything. Suddenly, a noise came from the corner of the room, softly, as if something was moving. I turned to look and saw the silhouette of a large object slowly looming in the distance, slowly approaching us. A chill washed over me, as if the air had become so still that a slight breeze would shatter it all. I held Rachel's hand tightly, but she had little strength left to fight back. The three of us stood there, motionless, like prey caught in an invisible trap. "What is it?" Rachel asked softly, her eyes wide, her gaze panicked. "I don't know," I answered, but I wasn't sure what else I could say. It felt like the room was trying to swallow us whole. The noise came again, a soft hiss this time, like the creaking of an iron door that hadn't been opened for a long time. But strangely, the sound came from behind the window covering. Something very large, was dragging across the floor, as if it had moved in from another dimension. We didn't dare to step closer, but curiosity and fear pulled us closer. I felt the presence of something inexplicable. It could be a creature, or it could be something that had transcended the limits of reality. I couldn't see clearly, but I knew I shouldn't go near it. The shadow swayed behind the cloth, as if someone was standing there, eyes fixed on us. I couldn't breathe, only feeling the cold rising in my body, invading every fiber of my being. No, I couldn't say anything more. We stood still like wild animals, waiting for something invisible to happen. Then, as if everything had been planned, the shadow suddenly disappeared. Not vanishing, but retreating into the darkness, leaving a silent void. An eerie silence. It felt like we were in a place that wasn't our real world. A sigh, soft but clear. Neither of us said anything. I turned my head and saw Chris staring into the corner of the room, his eyes vacant, as if he saw something we couldn't. I knew immediately he had seen something in that darkness. The shadow we had sensed but hadn't seen. "What is it?" John asked, but his voice was shaky, his breathing labored. Chris didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the window, his eyes bewildered. "Something isn't us," he said, his voice not his, but someone else's. "We're being watched." Suddenly the dark room dimmed, as if the light had been swallowed up, and the shadow returned. But this time, it was more than just a shadow. It was clear, present, and inexplicable. Everything was spinning. I heard a sigh, footsteps, a whoosh of wind, and then Rachel's scream. She ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. Every time she tried, it locked strangely, as if something invisible was holding us back. "Open the door," Rachel yelled, but her voice was choked. I turned to look at Chris and John. There was nothing either of us could do. Everything in this room had spiraled out of our control. Maybe we couldn't leave. Maybe room 13 was already occupied, and we were unwelcome guests. Story 8. Apartment 404 and Dark Memories. I am a newcomer to the city. After a long time working and living in cramped apartments, I was finally able to find a more spacious place to live. Apartment number 404 in the Beechwood apartment building was the place I chose. This building was over 30 years old, a place that seemed unremarkable among the concrete blocks of the city, but for me, it was a new hope. The rent was reasonable, the location was good, and especially, my apartment was on the 4th floor, not too high and not too low. When I first entered the apartment, I immediately felt the difference. Although it was not a luxury apartment, the atmosphere here was very quiet, very peaceful. I liked that, especially after stressful working days. This place was like a shelter. I started to pack my things and get used to this new space. That night, when I was about to go to bed, everything still seemed normal. I lay in bed, relaxing my body after a tiring day. But then, a sudden noise interrupted the silence. It was a creaking sound, like someone was moving around in the apartment. I opened my eyes, looked towards the door, but saw nothing. There was no one in this apartment but me. At first, I thought I was just tired and imagined the noise. But then, the creaking sound rang out again, this time clearer, as if someone was moving right in the living room. I sat up, looked around, saw nothing but pitch black darkness. What the hell was going on? A feeling of unease began to creep in. I stood up, walked out of the bedroom, and walked down the dark hallway towards the living room. Everything was the same. Nothing had changed. The windows were closed. The lights were still off. No one was here but me. But the noise continued. Now it was the creaking of footsteps. There were light footsteps, as if someone was moving from the living room to the kitchen. I went back to the bedroom, pulled out my phone, and checked the time. 3 a.m. I sighed, telling myself that maybe I was just too stressed. But then, the noise came again. This time clearer, as if someone was dragging something across the wooden floor. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to check. I turned on the light, walked out of the room, and headed towards the kitchen. This time, the noises stopped. I felt like I was being watched, but there was no one. As I approached the kitchen, I noticed a shadowy figure passing by the glass door of the dining room. It was an indistinct figure, seemingly moving lightly across the room. I didn't know what to do, just felt strange and uneasy. There was a feeling that something didn't belong here, as if it had been here for a long time, lurking in the old walls of this apartment. I walked around, checking every room, from the living room to the bathroom, all of which were nothing but darkness and silence. But then, I looked in the bathroom mirror, and something made me shiver. There seemed to be a figure standing behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one. A cold feeling rose up inside me. I tried to convince myself that it was just the light reflecting in the mirror, but I knew I couldn't lie anymore. There was something here. I began to feel like I was stuck in a vortex with no way out. The apartment suddenly felt cold and stuffy, even though the heating was still on. That strange feeling gradually increased. I couldn't sleep anymore. I kept pacing around the apartment. I even opened the window to try to breathe some fresh air. The next day, I researched the building and its history. I found information from an old neighbor, Mrs. Margaret. When I asked her about apartment number 404, she frowned and told me, "That apartment has a sad history. That apartment was the site of a suicide in the 80s. That girl jumped from the window and died right in this building. The name 404 suddenly had a different meaning for me. It was a loss, and there was no going back. What happened in this apartment still existed in the air, in the walls. I didn't know if I could live here for long, but a part of me couldn't leave, as if this apartment had possessed me. Like that, every night, the noise rang out at exactly 3 a.m. It was at that moment that I knew something was wrong here. Footsteps, strange sounds, and sometimes a cold breath beside me. I began to feel the presence of that girl, feeling like she had not left, and perhaps would never leave. This apartment had become a haven for dark memories, where souls still wandered, searching for salvation that they could not find. I didn't know what to do, but one thing I was sure of was that I had not simply moved into a new apartment. I had entered a space where the past and the present intertwined, where not all the people who lived here had left forever. Things started to get weirder after I heard Margaret talk about the death in apartment 404. The noises that night, they seemed to be more than just coincidences. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m. they appeared, regular and unchanging. Footsteps, heavy dragging noises, and sometimes rapid breathing, as if someone was trying to find a way to escape from somewhere. But what terrified me the most was not the sounds, but the cold feeling that clung to the apartment every night. I couldn't sleep, no matter how many ways I tried. I turned on all the lights in the apartment, even left the TV and radio on all night, but that didn't help. The feeling of fear still weighed on me, as if something invisible was staring at me from the darkness. I began to not dare to take my eyes off the dark corners of the room. The shadow I saw in the mirror last night couldn't be an illusion. There was something lurking in the darkness of this apartment. One night, while sitting on the sofa, I decided not to let those sounds haunt me anymore. I decided to open the window, hoping that a cool breeze could dispel the feelings of fear that were building up inside me. But as soon as I opened the door, I saw a dark figure standing on the opposite side, near the window of the apartment next door. A blurry figure, only vaguely visible in the weak light from the street lamps in the distance. I squinted, trying to see more clearly, but the dark figure did not move. It just stood still, as if waiting for something. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest. Even though I couldn't see the person's face clearly, I could feel his eyes on me. Then suddenly, the dark figure disappeared into the dark space. I quickly closed the window, trying to dispel the cold feeling that was rising inside me. But when I returned to the living room, I saw something inexplicable. The chair I had been sitting on had now moved to the middle of the room, as if someone had just sat down right in front of me. The chair could not have moved on its own. It was heavy, and I was sure that no one had entered this apartment without my knowledge. At this point, I began to feel a very strong presence in this apartment. I began to doubt what Margaret had said. Was there really a spirit in this apartment that had not yet passed on? Did that girl really commit suicide, as people said? Or could something even worse be waiting for me here? A few days later, I decided to find out more about the previous owner of apartment number 404. I went to see Margaret's best friend, who had lived in this apartment building for a long time, to ask more about the history of the building. Her name is Linda, an older woman, but very energetic and always ready to share interesting stories about the people who lived here. When I asked about apartment number 404, she seemed very hesitant, as if she didn't want to mention something. "You shouldn't ask about that apartment," Linda said, her eyes suddenly darkening. "It's an apartment with too many bad memories. Everyone here knows that no one lives there for long. At least not as long as the others." When I continued to ask about stories related to the apartment, Linda began to tell a story she heard from an old friend who used to live in this apartment. The story was about a man named James who rented apartment number 404 more than 10 years ago. He was a young man, newly moved to the city, and looking for a place to live for work. At first, James' life was normal, but after a while, he began to become strange, anxious, and tired. He quit his job and gradually cut off all contact with his friends and family. One day, he was found dead in his apartment, although there was no sign of suicide. Doctors concluded that the cause of death was a stroke, but something was wrong. Linda's friend said that in his last days, James always said that he heard footsteps at night, but when he checked, no one was there. Linda continued. Many people believe that this apartment has a strange power, something that cannot be explained. Maybe someone's spirit, or maybe the memories of people who lived here. Everyone feels that presence. And James, he's the last one, at least so far. So I know apartment number 404 is not an ordinary place. It was a place filled with mysterious stories, and perhaps not all the people who lived in this apartment were gone forever. I began to feel a strange feeling, as if I had been drawn into a story that I could not escape. I tried not to think about it too much, but the footsteps kept echoing in my head. They became clearer, as if they were pulling me into a bottomless black hole. Another night, I heard the familiar footsteps again at 3 a.m. But this time, they didn't stop at the strange steps. They became stronger, as if someone was knocking on my door, over and over. I didn't dare open the door, but the sound kept coming, relentless. When I turned to look in the mirror again, I saw not just one figure, but two. A shadowy figure standing beside me, almost merging with my body. It felt like there was a presence that I couldn't explain. I stood there motionless, my hands shaking, unable to speak. Then a whisper rang out in my ears, like a haunting reminder. Stay here. You'll never leave. I couldn't take it anymore. What I knew, what I felt, made it impossible for me to continue living here. This apartment not only holds the memories of a dead person, but also of all the people who lived here. And perhaps their deaths are not the end. I decided to leave, but as I was about to pack my things, I heard a knock on the door. I couldn't continue living in this apartment. It was beyond my endurance. After sleepless nights, after hearing strange footsteps and feeling inexplicable stares from the darkness, I decided to leave. I packed my things, putting them all into 3 large suitcases. Although I tried to do this quickly, something strange happened. Every time I turned around, I felt something standing behind me. A presence that couldn't be seen, but could be felt very clearly. The knocks continued to ring out as regularly as breathing. At first, they were very light, as if someone was just testing. But as I continued to stand there, each knock became stronger. Not like someone was waiting, but like something was trying to force me to turn around and face it. Every time I ignored it, every time I didn't answer, the knocks rang out again, more insistently. At this point, I no longer had the courage to step towards the door. I returned to the bedroom and locked the door. The footsteps, the soft breathing, all were clear in this space. The space in the apartment seemed to shrink. The space became heavier, as if I was surrounded by something invisible, but very present. And then I remembered Margaret's words. Apartment number 404 does not have just one soul. It has memories, unfinished stories. The people who live here, not all are gone forever. That sentence was like a bell ringing in my head, like a sign that I could not ignore. The feeling that I was being imprisoned in this apartment was not due to my imagination, but because something really existed here. Maybe a soul that had not yet been liberated. Maybe a memory that would not be forgotten. I decided that I could not continue to live in this obsession. I called a car to come and move immediately. When I stepped out of the bedroom, I suddenly felt something had changed. Everything was dark and quiet, but there was something different in the air. It felt like the apartment had changed, like it had transformed into a place that was not for humans. As I stepped out of the room and down the hallway, I suddenly realized that the darkness in the apartment was thicker and heavier than usual. I looked towards the window, where the light from the street lamp was still dim, but not enough to light up the apartment. I felt vaguely as if a layer of fog was covering my eyes, and I couldn't see any details clearly. I stood still for a moment, looking towards the window, where I could see my reflection. And then I realized, in that dark reflection, there was a figure standing right behind me. My whole body froze. I didn't dare to turn around, but my legs began to tremble. Part of me knew that the shadow was no illusion. It was so clear, and it couldn't be anything other than a person. A person standing still, not saying anything, but clearly looking at me. I couldn't control myself anymore. I turned around at full speed, but when I looked, there was no one in the room. But not everything disappeared. A noise came from the corner of the room, a familiar creaking sound, as if someone was moving. I slowly walked towards that corner of the room, where the weak light couldn't reach. I didn't want to go closer, but a strange feeling urged me to check. As I got closer, I saw a strange object lying on the floor. An old box, like a wooden box. That box, although it looked very old, did not seem like the furniture in this apartment. The top of the box was covered in a thick layer of dust. But what caught my attention was that it was right in the middle of the room, as if someone had put it there without my knowing. I bent down and opened the box. Inside were old things, but there was a photo, an old photo of a young girl with long hair, a delicate face, but something dark in her eyes. I couldn't take my eyes off that photo, and there was a strange feeling in my heart. The girl in the photo looked like, the name flashed in my mind, Jenny. I don't know why, but that was the name I thought of immediately when I saw her. I didn't remember ever meeting anyone named Jenny, but the feeling was too strong. I suddenly remembered Margaret's words. That girl, her name was Jenny, and she died in this apartment. A shiver ran down my spine. The photo was a reminder that things that could never be forgotten, souls that had not yet been released, were still here, in this apartment, in these walls. I left the room, hurriedly carrying the box outside. Suddenly the knocking sounded again, but this time it was not from apartment number 404. I saw someone standing outside the door. It was a woman, long hair, a familiar face, but there was something gloomy, as if she was not an ordinary person. "She wants to see you," the woman's voice echoed in the silence, but I couldn't answer, couldn't utter a word. She smiled, a mysterious smile, and stepped back, leaving a thick shadow in front of the door. My whole body went cold. She was waiting for me. She wanted me to step out of this apartment, where there was not just one soul but many, unsettled souls, waiting for me, as they had waited for all the others who had lived in this apartment. But I couldn't leave. I had to know the truth. This story wasn't over yet, and I was a part of it. Story 9. Shadow standing in the middle of the road. Haunted in the dark, I am a truck driver, and my job requires me to travel many deserted roads in the middle of the night. Sometimes I feel lonely, but I'm used to it. Especially that small road, the one I have to travel every night, hidden in the dense forests of Northern California. It is a road that, unless you are a person of my profession, few people have any reason to travel at such a late hour. And I'm familiar with everything about that road. The winding curves, the tall trees, the rare street lights, and the sound of the waves gently lapping against the shore of a nearby lake. Every night, I get in my car and drive this road around midnight. The visibility is not very good. The headlights illuminate a dark area. Only the faint light of a few distant street lamps shining through the trees. The sound of the car on the old concrete road is like a strange melody, not exactly pleasant. I had driven down that road 1,000 times, and yet something strange happened that I couldn't stop to think about. That night, I was driving down the same road as every other night. The feeling of the quiet night usually made me fall asleep easily. But that night, something was different. I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, right when I turned the first corner. At first I thought I was seeing things, because the dark figure was too hard to make out clearly in the dim light from the car's headlights. I stepped on the gas and tried to continue, but as soon as the car passed, I suddenly felt that something was wrong. The figure was still standing there, motionless, in the middle of the empty road. I stopped the car. My mind started to get fuzzy, as if something was preventing me from moving. But I decided to open the car door and call out, "Hey, what's going on? Need help?" There was no answer. It was strange. The person remained still, not moving at all, as if he didn't hear me. A cold feeling began to spread through my body. The surrounding trees seemed to be swaying slightly, but there was no wind. The atmosphere became so heavy that I could feel an unusual silence. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound coming from behind the figure, as if something was moving, or someone was breathing heavily. My heart beat faster. I couldn't say anything anymore. I could only stare at the figure. It seemed like time had stopped. I felt like I was frozen. The surrounding space became dim. The light from the car headlights was no longer enough to illuminate clearly. A few seconds later, the figure suddenly turned around. At that moment, I could only see a shadow, a blurry face, no eyes, no mouth, just a pale face in the darkness. Then I heard a sound. It was a strange sound, like something hitting the ground, then being dragged. A very unpleasant sound, continuous, as if something was stirring in the night. The shadow began to move, but not in a normal way. It swayed unnaturally, as if it was not a real person. I tried to get back to the car, my hands shaking as I held the steering wheel. At this point, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. My eyes saw the shadow gradually fading in the light of the car headlights, but the strange sound was still there, still echoing behind me. It was the sound of something dragging on the ground, and it was getting closer. A feeling of fear began to overwhelm me. I couldn't stop anymore. I stepped on the gas and continued driving, but the sound didn't stop. How many times have I passed this road without thinking anything strange? But tonight, I couldn't deny that something unusual was happening. I began to feel like something was following me, following my every step. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw that shadow. I didn't know who or what it was, but I could feel its presence more and more clearly. I didn't dare stop anymore, just tried to drive as fast as possible, following the familiar road in the dark. When I stopped at a nearby intersection, the dim lights from the surrounding houses suddenly made me breathe a little easier. but the strange sound still echoed in my head, unable to be dispelled. The image of the shadow still haunted my mind. At that moment, I realized something horrifying. I didn't just hear the sound, I also felt its presence right next to me. It wasn't a person. It was no ordinary ghost. And in that moment, I knew I had entered another world. A world that I had no control over. I stopped and closed my eyes, trying to calm myself down. But when I opened my eyes again, I couldn't see the figure anymore. I sighed in relief, thinking that maybe I was just imagining things. But just as I was about to continue driving, a sudden cold wind blew, as if something was standing right behind me. There was no one around, but I clearly felt that figure was still somewhere, just waiting for me to turn back. I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror. That shadow, I couldn't erase it from my mind. Every time I looked at the mirror, even if it was just a glimpse, I felt it. Even though I tried to convince myself that everything was just an illusion, the anxiety still gnawed at me. I drove down the deserted road, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other holding the phone, deciding to call someone to ease my anxiety. But no one answered. The journey down this road that night made me feel even more alone. There was no one, no sound except the sound of the car's engine and the rustling of leaves in the wind. But there was something too quiet. It was as if I was passing through another space, a space that did not belong to this world. Even stranger, when my headlights hit the tops of the ancient trees on either side of the road, I saw dark shadows, indistinct shapes, as if they were moving in my field of vision, even though I couldn't see any wind or anything affecting them. I closed my eyes, forced myself to breathe deeply, trying to shake off the strange feeling. I must be too tired, I thought, and told myself to concentrate on driving. I drove through the dark woods, then suddenly realized that I had been on this road for so long without seeing anything strange. It had always felt peaceful, even boring. But now, as the dark nights continued, it had become a place that was no longer familiar, a place that I couldn't understand. Suddenly, I saw the figure again, in the same place in the middle of the road. It stood still, not moving, not stirring. I stopped the car immediately. This time, I was not scared anymore. The fear was so familiar that I could almost control it. But this made me curious. Tonight, I decided to do something different. I opened the car door and stepped out. The cold night wind made me shiver, but I didn't care. The figure was still standing there, right in the middle of the road, not moving. I took a deep breath and stepped closer. The darkness seemed to swallow up all the surrounding sounds. It was just me and the figure. "Do you want to get in the car?" I asked, my voice echoing in the strange silence. There was no answer. The figure just stood there, eyes not moving. My feet were glued to the ground. I couldn't move any further. There was only one thing that was pulling me closer, something I couldn't identify. Suddenly, there was a loud noise, as if something had fallen to the ground. I turned around, just in time to see the figure moving very quickly, like a black shadow passing by. The cold feeling made my heart stop. I turned back to the car, quickly got in and closed the door. But the shadow continued to move in front of my eyes. I could feel it, as if it was watching me from behind. I don't know how much time had passed when I drove down that road again. There was no one, but the fear still followed me, following my every step. The following nights were the same, except for one thing that was different. Strange sounds. One night, as I drove down that road, a strange noise came from behind the car. First there was a rattling sound, then footsteps, crunching on the road. It sounded like someone was running after me, but when I turned around, I saw no one. My heart started to beat faster. I didn't dare stop the car anymore. I stepped on the gas faster. I drove through the dark streets, but the noise didn't stop. It kept ringing, repeating. I couldn't understand why. The footsteps seemed to be stuck with me, unable to escape. Then, once again, I stopped, feeling unable to continue. I opened the car door, but there was no one. Suddenly, I heard a sigh behind me. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. I turned around and saw that figure standing right behind the car. I couldn't move, couldn't say anything. I could only stand there, facing that figure. But strangely, I didn't feel as scared as before. I felt something familiar, though I couldn't understand it. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice now sounding strangely weak. There was no answer. There was only steady breathing, as if the figure was standing still, waiting. That feeling seemed to tear my mind apart, but I couldn't leave. Something was holding me back, as if an invisible force was pulling me in. Suddenly, the shadow came closer. My eyes couldn't take their eyes off it. I could see the faint light reflecting from its eyes, but I couldn't see clearly. The shadow grew larger and larger, so close that I could feel its cold breath. A strange noise came from behind me again, this time from inside my car. A bang, then a cold wind rushed into the car, forcing me to turn around. The car door was open. No one knew when it would open again. That feeling was unbearable. This time, I couldn't drive anymore. That deserted road, the road I had passed by so many times, now became a dead end. A dead end that I couldn't get out of. The shadow was still standing, but now it was more than just a shadow. It was like some kind of entity, something that didn't belong to this world. I knew what I had to do, but when I looked into those eyes, I couldn't pull away. I stood there, with the shadow, and a single question in my mind. Can I leave this path, or am I stuck forever? Story 10. Whispers from the Strange Phone. The Hidden Truth. I had always thought that I was not the type of person who was easily bothered by strange things. It was only when I received a call from my mother that I realized that those strange things sometimes made it impossible to escape. "You have to clean out the old shed in the house," my mother said calmly, as if it were a very simple task. "I don't have the strength anymore. You have to do it." Hearing those words, I felt a little hesitant. My family's old shed was a space full of memories that I had always avoided. It was a place that contained old furniture, dusty boxes, and family items that no one wanted to touch anymore. But the strange thing was that every time my mother mentioned that shed, she seemed a little worried. Something in her words made me feel that this shed contained more than just ordinary objects, so I couldn't refuse. I pulled out my old coat, stepped out into the cold, and headed towards the old shed. The sun was slowly setting behind the gray clouds, creating a gloomy atmosphere, as if signaling that something was about to happen. The old warehouse door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the air was damp and cold. The smell of old wood and dust made me feel like time had stopped here. I turned on the light. The weak rays of light, only enough to illuminate a small area in the large space. This warehouse really hadn't changed much since the last time I entered here. Old tables, rusty iron cabinets, and household items that I only knew from my mother's stories still lay quietly in the dark corners. I sighed, starting to clean up the boxes and belongings. Some items were covered in a thick layer of dust. I carefully wiped them away, trying not to let my mind get caught up in the gloom of the warehouse. But when I moved the large wooden table away from the corner, I saw something that made me stop. An old telephone. At first I thought it was just an unremarkable old thing. But as I got closer, I realized it was unlike any other antique phone I had ever seen. It had a strange design, like a desk phone from the 60s, but with handcrafted details, strange lines that I couldn't explain. I couldn't resist my curiosity. With an automatic movement, I found the power cord and plugged it into the socket. When I pressed the button, a slight current ran through my hand. In a split second, the phone made a sound. Not a ringing sound like I had imagined, but a small, unfamiliar voice, as if from another world. I was startled, my heart beating fast. "Check the left corner of the room," the voice said, cold and clear, like an order. I stood still, unable to believe my ears. The voice did not belong to anyone in my family, not my mother, nor anyone else I had ever known. But how could he talk to me like this? Who installed this phone? And how could he know so many details about my room? A feeling of fear rose in my heart, but an invisible force seemed to pull me closer to the phone. The questions kept spinning in my head, but I could not stop. Suddenly, the phone made another sound. The voice rang out again, this time clearer, but also more powerful. "These are not your family's memories. This is the hidden truth." I felt like I was being sucked into an invisible space. The warehouse suddenly became suffocating, no longer had normal light. Every corner, every old table and chair became dark and scary. Those words still rang in my head, unable to be erased. The feeling of unease and the urge to know the truth kept me from leaving the room. Now I was afraid of more than just the whispers of the phone. I began to doubt my own family. Did my mother know something that she didn't want to tell me? Was what I knew about my family's past just a shell, and something deeper was hidden? I began to search the warehouse for signs, but there was nothing unusual, except for the strange phone that continued to emit that strange voice. The sudden cold made me shiver. The door to the warehouse suddenly slammed shut, and darkness enveloped me. I wanted to escape, to get rid of that feeling of fear. But the phone kept calling, kept threatening me that I didn't understand the whole story, that this warehouse was more than just a place to store things. And when I turned to look at the phone again, I noticed something strange. It was looking back at me, like it knew I would come back, like it had been waiting for this all along. I didn't know what to do. Everything was getting too scary, too uncertain. But one thing I was sure of: this phone was no ordinary object. It was more than a household item. It was a doorway to a truth I couldn't imagine. I couldn't leave the old warehouse. Even though my body wanted to run away from the stuffy air and the incessant whispers coming from the old phone, I couldn't move. I stood still, my feet tied to the floor, unable to move. The phone still made that strange sound, but this time it was different. It wasn't the cold and commanding voice like before, but a mumbled, unclear voice, like someone telling an incomplete story. The words were vague but very clear, haunting me. We don't want to hurt you, but the truth needs to be known. I felt a cold wind blow through the room, as if someone had just walked past me. The feeling was accompanied by a strange fear. I couldn't understand why the phone could make such sounds. Those sounds were unlike anything I had ever heard. But no matter how scared I was, part of me couldn't stop searching for answers. There was something I had to understand. I stepped closer to the phone, this time to turn it off. But as soon as I touched it, the sound stopped. There was no sound. The room was silent, save for my breathing. I looked around, feeling like something was watching me from the shadows. A presence I couldn't see, but could feel. I looked at the phone. Its face was still dimly lit, and I felt like someone was looking at me through it. For some reason, I began to feel something familiar about it, like I'd seen it somewhere before. A strange connection that I couldn't explain. "Check the left corner," the voice said again. This time, it was as if it was speaking directly into my ear. Quiet, but haunting. I jerked my head back and looked around the room. The left corner of the room, where the old wooden cabinet was a place I had never noticed before. The feeling of unease continued, but I still couldn't stop. An invisible force pulled me towards that corner of the room, towards the cabinet. I opened the door, wondering what I would find there. When the door opened, I saw a pile of old things. Things that I couldn't immediately recognize. But among the pile, a small wooden box caught my attention. This box was unlike any other in the warehouse. It was carved with intricate patterns, with very old lines, like a family heirloom. I couldn't remember seeing it before, but I had a strange feeling, like this box had some very important meaning. I opened the box. Inside was an old photo, a black and white photo. When I looked at the photo, my heart stopped beating. The photo was of a family, but not my family. They were wearing old clothes, but what made me shiver was the presence of a person in the photo. It was a tall man. His face was unclear, but he was standing right next to my mother. I had never seen this man before, but I had a strange feeling that he was very familiar. I began to feel the air in the room getting heavier and heavier. Vague memories flooded back, but I couldn't figure out what was going on. Whose photo was this? Why was it in this old box? And why was my mother connected to the people in the photo that I had never heard her mention? I picked up the photo, looked at it more closely. Suddenly, there was a slight noise behind me. I turned around immediately. The old storage door slammed shut. A cold wind blew past me, making me shiver. I swallowed a mouthful of saliva, feeling confused and scared. What was going on? Why did things turn out like this? At this moment, the old phone started to make a sound again. But this time, it wasn't a cold voice or a whisper like before. The sound coming from the phone was an old song. The sound was very familiar, but I couldn't remember the name of the song. It was a rhythmic, melodious melody, but it made me feel like something was wrong. I looked at the phone, and suddenly a dim light flashed in the space. A faint figure appeared in the corner of the room where the wooden cabinet was standing. I stared at that figure, unable to speak. It was a man, just like the one in the photo I had just found. But he wasn't an ordinary human. He was transparent, like a ghost, and I could feel that he was looking at me. The feeling of this presence was heavy, as if he was trying to communicate with me. The strange sounds from the phone rang again, this time as if leading me into a conversation I couldn't fully understand. You need to know the truth about your family, the voice said. This time not the voice of a normal person, but the voice of someone long gone. I couldn't breathe. Everything around me became blurry, leaving only the phone and that blurry figure. Why was this happening? Who was talking to me through this phone, and why were these words? Words I had never heard before. What should I do? The questions kept spinning in my head, but I couldn't answer them. Everything was too vague, too strange. But one thing I knew for sure. This phone was not normal. It has a strong connection to my family, and I need to know the truth. I couldn't forget that phone. The words in it kept lingering in my mind like a nightmare that couldn't be turned off. Every time I tried to ignore it, every time I thought I had the courage to continue my normal life, it would appear in my mind like something that couldn't be denied. After that night, I decided to learn more about the phone and everything around it. I felt a pull from within, as if the phone was urging me to dig deeper into the past, into things I never wanted to know. But I couldn't stop. Everything inside me seemed to be controlled by that phone. The next day, I couldn't wait any longer. I went back to the warehouse where I found the phone. A cold feeling filled the space, and the air in the warehouse seemed thicker than yesterday. The old object still lay silently in the dark corner. Nothing had changed. But this time, I wasn't just looking for the phone. I was looking for answers. I started searching through the boxes, carefully turning over layers of dust, layers of old papers, looking for any trace that could explain why the phone was there, why it was making strange sounds. I rummaged through the pile of old things and accidentally discovered a small notebook lying at the bottom of a wooden cabinet. This notebook, completely different from the surrounding things. It had a leather cover, faded with time, with small but clear engravings. I opened it, and the pages inside contained something I couldn't immediately understand. The handwriting was old, the ink faded, but still clear enough for me to read. December 4th, 1956. They never understood why I kept this phone, but it had power, and I couldn't let it go. I had to protect it. There was something in it that I couldn't tell anyone, but I felt it would help me, would save me from things I couldn't face. Why was I the last one? The only one left. Maybe I was wrong, but now I can't turn back. The name Old Phone still lingered in every word, every note in the notebook. A cold feeling began to invade me. My mind was spinning, as if this notebook was leading me into a maze of truths that I wasn't ready to explore. I continued reading, and each word made me more confused. Don't let it fall into anyone else's hands. Never let anyone touch it except me. Otherwise, what I saw will be irreparable. They will come back. And when they do, I can't promise that everything will be okay. It felt like someone was standing behind me, watching my every move, forcing me to turn around and look. But there was no one. The old warehouse was still quiet still, but the atmosphere was heavier than ever. I closed the notebook, a feeling of unease rising in my heart. I looked towards the old phone. At this time, the phone no longer made a sound like before, but it still held an inexplicable mystery. It was like an object that had been forgotten by time, but could transmit words, sounds that I couldn't understand. I decided to take the phone and the notebook home. Even though I knew it might be the wrong decision, I felt like I had no other choice. When I got home, I put them on the table, unable to stop thinking about all that I had discovered. I couldn't stop thinking about the words in the notebook. They will come back. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, only the dim light from the desk lamp shining on the phone. Vague images of my family, of the dead, kept appearing in my mind. I thought about the notebook and the notes in it. I thought about the warnings. But the strangest thing was, I started to hear sounds from the phone. It wasn't a voice like before, but a very small sound, like breathing. But there was something hidden behind it. I jumped up, looked at the phone. It was dimly lit, but no one was saying anything. I listened, trying to figure out what the sound was. And then I realized it was someone breathing. Someone very close to me. Feeling scared again, I stood up and walked towards the phone. But as soon as I touched it, the sound disappeared. I let out a breath, but still couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing right behind me. What was going on with this phone? And why was it affecting me like this? I felt a strong urge to find out more. I went back to the old storage room the next day. I found something else I didn't expect. An old painting placed in the corner of the room. This painting was unlike any other painting in the house. It was a painting of a family, but this painting was not like ordinary paintings. The faces in it were blurred, as if erased by an invisible force. But strangely, I recognized a familiar face in it. It was my mother's face. I couldn't believe my eyes. This picture. How could my mother be in it? And how could it exist in the family's old storage? The fear I felt this time was indescribable. All the questions I had about the phone, about the strange sounds, about the notebook and the warnings, now became just one big question without an answer. Is my family connected to all of this? And can I escape this vicious cycle before it's too late? The old warehouse came alive in my mind again, and I knew that I couldn't stop. No matter where the story went, I couldn't turn back. I had to keep digging into the secrets it held.